They didn't lose their crowns to love. They lost them to a game designed for no one to survive. Hidden inside the glitter of Henry VIII's court were wounds that queens carried in silence, betrayals that never reached the records, and decisions that reshaped a kingdom without mercy. Every marriage cut deeper than the last, leaving ghosts behind each throne. Tonight, we step into that world and watch how queens became enemies in a battle they never chose. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If one were to stand at the edge of Henry VIII's court and simply watch, it would be easy to believe that marriage there was a matter of ceremony and devotion. All polished surfaces and polite gestures. Ministers moved through corridors with their records tucked under their arms. Ambassadors whispered about treaties, and courtiers bowed with practiced grace. To an outsider, it might look like a place where alliances were made through delicate agreements, and where royal marriages formed the natural centre of political life. The truth, however, ran deeper and colder than the stone floors beneath those grand halls. Marriage, in this court, was not a private bond, but a battlefield. And every queen carried with her the weight of nations, churches, and families that depended on her success. Catherine of Aragon stood as the clearest example of this. She arrived not just as a bride, but as the daughter of the Catholic monarchs of Spain, a living extension of their influence. Her marriage to Henry was seen as a union between two powerful realms, and every judgment she made carried echoes of her homeland. Her presence reassured Europe that England remained aligned with Catholicism, and her advisors moved through the court with quiet authority. To many, she represented stability, tradition, and the kind of legitimacy that could anchor a king still early in his reign. But even then, beneath the calm, the pressure surrounding her was immense. A queen was expected to secure the future with an heir, and each passing year without a son carved small cracks into her foundation. Those cracks widened the moment Anne Boleyn appeared. She did not carry royal blood or the backing of a great empire. What she possessed instead was ambition sharpened by intelligence, a sense of timing, and an awareness of how power shifted around her. The court had never seen a woman who could speak to Henry with such confidence, who could deny him and still draw him closer. Her presence changed the rhythm of the palace. Rooms once filled with quiet discussion now buzzed with speculation. Some admired her boldness, others despised her intrusion. But all understood one thing: her influence was undeniable, and her rise threatened every structure that Catherine had held in place. The moment Henry sought to end his marriage to Catherine, the court ceased, pretending that royal weddings were matters of affection. They were instruments of strategy, tools reshaping entire nations. The king's desire collided with the authority of Rome, dragging all of England into a conflict that reached far beyond the walls of the palace. Catherine refused to step aside, knowing that her removal would weaken everything she represented. Anne refused to retreat, knowing that victory would elevate her family and reshape England's spiritual landscape. Their struggle was not the rivalry of two women, it was the collision of two worlds, each demanding to be recognized. As the months passed, the atmosphere in the court thickened. Ambassadors wrote anxious letters home. Priests debated doctrine, and nobles shifted loyalties with an unease they tried to hide. The marriages of a king were supposed to strengthen a dynasty, but here they fractured the nation instead. The king himself moved between confidence and frustration, driven by his desires, yet constrained by forces larger than himself. Every decision he made deepened divisions that would not heal quickly. It was not simply love or disappointment that shaped his actions. It was the realization that each queen embodied a political faction, and choosing one meant raising a banner against the other. Even ordinary citizens felt the weight of these choices. In markets and taverns, people whispered about Catherine's dignity and Anne's influence. Some feared a break with Rome, while others supported it. The dispute over a marriage transformed into a question of national identity. And still, inside the palace, life continued with unsettling normalcy. Servants polished silver, musicians played at feasts, and the king walked with his wives as though nothing monumental hung over their heads. But beneath that surface, the foundations of the country were shifting. Subtle at first, but irreversible over time. The court did not erupt in sudden violence or dramatic confrontations. Instead, the transformation happened through quiet movements, a signature on a document, a sermon delivered with new meaning, a council meeting where one voice sounded louder than before. Marriage had become a political instrument, and queens were no longer simply partners to a king. They were symbols, proxies, and shields. Each carried the expectations of many, yet none were truly protected by the crown they wore. Looking at the early years of Henry's reign, one might wonder how such a personal matter became a storm capable of reshaping England. But in the stillness of that court, beneath the polished etiquette and the careful smiles, marriage had always been intertwined with ambition. The kingship demanded a legacy, the church demanded obedience, and Europe demanded alignment. The Queen stood at the centre of all of these demands, pulled in every direction, never allowed to exist simply as a woman or a partner. Her position was as fragile as it was exalted, and every whisper in the corridors could change her fate. The rise of one queen almost always marked the fall of another. Each arrival generated hope for some and fear for others. Each departure left behind wounds that the kingdom would carry for years. It was a cycle that repeated itself with an unsettling calm, as though the court had accepted that this was the price of power. Behind the grandeur, the truth remained. Marriage here was diplomacy, warfare, and survival, woven into a single institution. And for those who lived within it, there was no place where emotion existed without consequence. In that world, alliances shifted like shadows at dusk, and even the king's heart offered no safety. What seemed like affection could vanish within a season, replaced by suspicion or blame. A queen might enter the palace with blessings and applause, only to leave under guard or not leave at all. No one, queen, a noble, or servant, misunderstood the reality. They knew they were standing on ground that could change beneath them without warning. The struggle between these women reveals how power quietly reshaped the court with every choice the king made. The lines drawn around them widened into forces that pulled an entire nation into conflict. And in the silence that settled after each shift, one could sense that something far more dangerous was beginning to form in the spaces between them. She entered the English court carrying the weight of an empire, long before anyone understood what that burden would mean. As the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, Catherine of Aragon brought with her more than jewels or dowries. She carried the authority of Catholic Spain, a power that stretched far beyond the walls of any palace in England. Her presence alone signalled that England stood aligned with the most formidable Catholic kingdoms of the age, and the court treated her with the quiet respect reserved for someone whose lineage could open or close the doors of entire continents. Everything about her life in those early years reflected that standing. Ambassadors approached her chambers with careful steps. Ministers recognized the value of her counsel, and even Henry relied on her judgment in matters that extended far beyond domestic life. She proved capable in ways that were visible even to those who disliked her. When Henry marched to France, Catherine acted as regent, and the court accepted her authority without protest. She understood diplomacy with an ease shaped by her upbringing, moving through political matters with the calm precision expected from someone raised in a house where decisions affected half of Europe. Her education, rare for women of her time, allowed her to speak confidently among scholars and clergy. Her devotion to Catholic orthodoxy ran deep, and many within the church believed she would anchor England firmly within the familiar structures of Rome. To the public, she embodied stability, dignity, and continuity, qualities that made her appear immovable, as though her role beside the king was as certain as the faith she defended. Yet even within that sense of stability, a small and quiet pressure existed. The future of a dynasty depended on children, and each year, without a surviving son, tightened the expectations around her. Miscarriages and infant deaths, common in the era, did not lessen the scrutiny. People whispered in taverns and alleys, wondering whether the Queen's age or fortune was failing her. At court, the tension appeared in subtler forms: a pause in conversation, an exchanged glance, a silence that lasted a moment too long. Catherine continued her duties without change, but those around her knew that her inability to produce a male heir would eventually reshape how others viewed her influence. Her strength in diplomacy became a double-edged weapon. As long as she appeared politically advantageous, ministers and nobles aligned themselves with her. But the same qualities that once made her valuable now highlighted the risks of maintaining her position without the security of a son. England's relationship with Spain shifted as political climates changed, and Catherine's foreign birth, once a symbol of alliance, became an easy mark for criticism among those hoping to rise through different channels of power. The same ambassadors who once admired her now studied her more cautiously, aware that her place in the court was no longer absolute. Inside the palace, however, daily routines continued. Servants prepared her rooms. Priests visited with messages from Rome, and Catherine herself followed the same rhythms she had maintained for decades. But beneath that surface, something had altered. Her role had begun to depend less on who she was and more on what she could no longer provide. The corridors that once carried her influence now carried rumours. Quiet at first, but persistent. There was no single moment when her position weakened, only a gradual accumulation of doubts, shifting alliances, and private ambitions that turned against her. Her dignity, once a shield, could not stop those movements. Henry's growing frustration changed the atmosphere of the court. What had once been admiration became impatience, and impatience soon turned into a search for alternatives. The issue was framed as religious, legal, or moral, depending on who spoke. But underneath those arguments lay something simpler. Catherine had not delivered the heir that England expected. As Henry's desire for a new beginning increased, the people closest to him adjusted their positions with care. Some distanced themselves from Catherine quietly, slipping away from her cause without announcing their departure. Others pushed more aggressively, hoping that supporting the king's dissatisfaction would earn them favour. Catherine herself endured this silent withdrawal with the same composure that defined her. Though the isolation around her grew with each passing month, her relationship with foreign ambassadors shifted as well. Eustace Chapuis, the representative of the Holy Roman Empire, remained one of her most loyal defenders. But even he noted the tightening circle around her. Letters from Spain carried cautious tones, as if acknowledging that political winds might soon turn, and that Catherine, despite her lineage, could not depend indefinitely on the support of European powers. The marriage that once united nations had begun to expose fractures within them. Her identity as both Queen of England and Princess of Spain placed her in a position where every decision held consequences for two realms. Yet she found herself unable to influence the outcome that mattered most. As Anne Boleyn's presence intensified, the contrast between the two women became impossible to ignore. Catherine represented tradition, established alliances, and Catholic integrity. Anne represented reformist energy, new ambitions, and a different vision of England's future. Those who supported Catherine saw Anne as a disruption. Those who supported Anne viewed Catherine as an obstacle to progress under a king who wished to reshape his world. The divide did not erupt in loud conflict, but manifested in daily choices, where people stood during court functions, whose letters they answered first, whose favour they sought. Catherine remained outwardly composed, but the erosion of her influence was visible to anyone who observed closely. Still, she did not retreat. Her resilience stemmed from a lifetime of duty, reinforced by her belief that her marriage was lawful and her position sacred. She appeared at court functions, maintained her alliances, and continued her religious commitments with the same resolve she had shown from the start. Yet even her resolve could not prevent what was coming. The king's determination, the church's pressures, and the shifting ambitions of nobles formed a tide she could not turn back. What once appeared stable now revealed itself to be fragile. A queen backed by the might of Spain and the authority of Rome found herself standing alone in a court that had already begun to turn away. Her story marked the first of many fractures in Henry's household, a reminder that even the most powerful alliances could crumble when confronted with the demands of a king whose desires grew larger than the structures meant to contain them. Her fall began quietly, shaped by expectations she could not meet. The court watched the distance widen between her and the king, sensing a change that reached far beyond their private chambers. And in the shadows of that change, another force waited to take her place, carrying with it consequences the kingdom had not yet imagined. She entered the court not with the authority of a foreign empire, but with something far quieter and more disruptive. An unusual confidence that drew attention long before anyone spoke her name. Anne Boleyn did not resemble the women who typically surrounded a king. Her charm was not born from softness or obedience, but from a sharp intelligence that shaped every gesture she made. She understood how people watched her, how curiosity turned into desire, and how desire gradually became influence. In the early days, she moved through the court with measured precision, offering neither too much nor too little. For some, she appeared bold. For others, she seemed unsettling. Yet all of them noticed her. And in a world built on observation, being seen was the first step toward power. The king noticed her as well, first with interest, then with insistence. The court expected the usual pattern: a brief fascination followed by boredom, a gift or two, a forgotten name. But Anne did not allow herself to be absorbed into that rhythm. She maintained a distance that both confused and captivated Henry. Her refusals, subtle yet deliberate, forced him to pursue her with a determination rarely seen in a monarch accustomed to immediate compliance. The balance between them shifted quietly. By withholding what others offered freely, she created a space in which Henry's desire grew into something far more dangerous than affection: obsession. As their connection deepened, the court began to change. Ministers adjusted their positions, watching carefully which direction the king leaned. Servants observed new routines forming around her presence. Ambassadors wrote reports noting her growing influence, concerned not only by her relationship with Henry, but by what it might mean for England's alliances. Anne's supporters increased in number, drawn by the possibility of a rising force within the palace. Her detractors multiplied just as quickly, fueled by fear that this woman without royal blood or foreign backing might overturn everything established through Catherine's long tenure. She understood the magnitude of the king's frustration with his marriage, and quietly nurtured the idea that a new union could solve more than a personal disappointment. The path she encouraged required a break with Rome, a step so drastic that it threatened the religious foundation England had lived under for centuries. Yet Anne pressed forward, not with loud declarations but with steady confidence, suggesting possibilities that the king grew increasingly willing to embrace. Her influence did not appear in public speeches or official documents. It appeared in private decisions. Subtle shifts, and the steady erosion of Catherine's position. The more Henry moved toward Anne, the more divided the kingdom became. Some saw her as the future, a symbol of new ideas, new faith, and a break from the constraints imposed by foreign powers. Others saw her as a threat, a woman whose presence disrupted the sanctity of marriage and the authority of the church. In the streets, Catherine remained the favoured queen, but inside the palace, where power gathered in corners and along corridors, Anne's shadow lengthened. Her ascent was not loud, but it was undeniable. It was felt in the way ministers changed their loyalties, in the quiet removal of those who supported Catherine, and in the new confidence of those who believed Anne would soon become queen. Yet her rise carried a cost. The factions forming around her created tension that spread through every level of society. Priests argued in churches, merchants whispered in marketplaces, and nobles debated in private chambers. Some believed Anne represented corruption and ambition unchecked. Others believed she offered liberation from the weight of Roman authority. Whether admired or despised, she had become a force that reshaped England simply by standing beside the king. Inside the court, her presence altered daily life. Catherine's supporters felt the ground shift beneath them and adjusted their alliances in a quiet panic. Servants who once served Catherine now bowed differently when Anne passed. Even the king behaved with a restless urgency, driven by the belief that a new beginning awaited him if only the obstacles could be removed. Every gesture, every decision, every tension seemed to point toward an inevitable change. Anne herself appeared composed throughout this transformation. She wore her new influence, not with arrogance, but with a controlled awareness, as though she knew that every advantage she gained also created an opening for danger. She walked through the palace with the calm of someone who understood the fragility of favour and the volatility of power. But she continued forward, propelled by a conviction that her future lay not in the shadows of the court, but at its centre. Her ascent was not a sudden leap, but a steady climb built on intelligence, timing, and the king's unwavering obsession. By the time the kingdom realized how deeply she had altered its future, the path had already been chosen. The divide she created would not heal easily, and the consequences of her rise stretched far beyond the private chambers where it began. Her emergence fractured a court that once believed itself stable, leaving behind tensions that could no longer be dismissed as ordinary rivalries. The lines between loyalty and ambition began to blur as the king's choices pulled the kingdom toward an unfamiliar direction. What waited beyond her rise carried a weight no one in the palace was prepared to face. The shift between Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn did not begin with a declaration or a single moment that could be pointed to as the start of a fall. It began quietly, in the spaces where power changes most effectively: small decisions, altered routines, and the gradual withdrawal of loyalty. Catherine had once stood at the centre of the English court, with the authority of a queen supported by a vast Catholic realm. Yet, as Henry's attention moved toward Anne, the court adjusted itself with unsettling ease. People no longer gathered around Catherine with the same confidence. Ministers who once sought her guidance now approached her less frequently. The air around her chambers seemed to grow still, as though the palace itself recognized the fading of her influence. Anne's presence filled that void long before Catherine lost her crown. She appeared in hallways where Catherine once walked, sat in rooms where Catherine once held counsel, and attracted eyes that had previously observed the Queen. There was no attempt to hide this shift. The court understood that the king's desires now revolved around another woman, and desire at court often carried more power than treaties or tradition. Anne did not wear the title of queen, yet she held the king's attention with a force that overshadowed Catherine's long-established position. It was a kind of influence that reshaped the daily rhythm of the court long before any formal changes were announced. The religious dimension of their conflict deepened the divide. Catherine, rooted firmly in Catholic doctrine, represented England's long-standing allegiance to Rome. Anne, however, symbolized a different future. Her connection to reformist ideas, though not always explicitly stated, aligned with Henry's growing frustration toward the church. What began as a personal conflict between two women expanded into a national struggle over faith and authority. Priests debated in churches, nobles whispered in private gatherings, and foreign ambassadors observed with concern as the kingdom drifted toward a transformation that could not be undone. The tension between Catholic loyalty and emerging Protestant influence became inseparable from the tension between Catherine and Anne. Inside the palace, Catherine continued her duties with the composure of someone trained from childhood to embody dignity. She attended Mass, met with her attendants, and carried herself as though her position remained secure. Yet the signs around her painted a different picture. Servants assigned to her household were reassigned without explanation. Advisors who once spoke confidently in her presence grew cautious in their words. Even the king began to maintain a distance that widened, slowly but steadily. Catherine's understanding of her situation did not come from emotional outbursts or dramatic confrontations. It came from observing these quiet alterations, each one signaling that support for her was eroding. And, meanwhile, navigated the court with a growing awareness of her influence. She did not need to speak boldly or challenge Catherine openly. Her presence alone altered conversations, influenced decisions, and redirected the attention of the king's closest counselors. She represented possibility, a new marriage, a new heir, and a new direction for the kingdom. Those who wished to align themselves with the future found their way to her orbit. Those who feared change clung to Catherine, though their numbers diminished as the king's intentions became clearer. The moment Catherine was formally removed from her position felt less like a sudden fall and more like the final acknowledgement of a reality already established. She was instructed to leave the court, placed in increasingly isolated residences, and denied the title she had carried for decades. Her daughter Mary, once the acknowledged heir, lost her standing as well. Catherine endured these losses with the same restraint she had shown throughout her life. But even the strongest composure could not hide the weight of being replaced. Replaced not by chance, but by a woman who had walked into the court and rerouted the future of a kingdom. Anne's coronation marked the culmination of Catherine's long decline. Crowds watched, some with approval, many with resentment. For them, witnessing Anne take the place, long held by the respected Catherine, felt like a rupture in the natural order. But the court, accustomed to adjusting itself around the king's desires, accepted the change with the familiar resignation of people who knew that their fortunes depended on adaptability. The new queen stepped into her role with confidence, aware that her victory carried the momentum of a national transformation behind it. Yet the triumph did not erase the bitterness that lingered. Catherine's supporters viewed Anne not simply as a new wife, but as the direct cause of their queen's downfall. Their loyalty remained strong, even as it became politically dangerous to express. Anne, in turn, understood that her new position came with hostility woven into its fabric. Her rise had not healed the divisions in the kingdom, it had deepened them. Catherine faded from the centre of court life, but her absence did not silence her influence. She remained a symbol of the old order and the faith England had followed for generations. Every decision Anne made, every step Henry took, played against the memory of the woman who had once stood beside him with the authority of Spain and the Church behind her. The conflict between these two women, one removed, one ascendant, continued to shape England long after Catherine's crown was taken from her. Her fall settled into the court like a shadow that refused to lift, leaving behind a silence that revealed how deeply the loss had sunk in. The power shift continued to send slow ripples through every chamber as people adjusted themselves to a new centre of influence. A sense of unease gathered around the crown, hinting that the change now in motion carried consequences no one could yet measure. Public sentiment surrounding Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn grew into a force as influential as any decision within the royal court. Support for Catherine extended across towns and villages, carried by people who saw her as a symbol of dignity and moral certainty. Her long presence in England, combined with the quiet endurance she showed during years of loss and disappointment, shaped an image of a queen who embodied stability. Many felt a familiarity in her struggles and respected the composure she maintained despite the erosion of her position. Whenever she appeared in public, crowds responded with a depth of loyalty that revealed how deeply she had rooted herself in the hearts of the people. Resistance toward Anne Boleyn formed with equal intensity, though far more turbulent in tone. Her rise unsettled those who believed the Queen's place should be protected by tradition and religious law. Anne entered public awareness abruptly, carrying with her the impression of ambition that exceeded the expected limits of courtly behaviour. People repeated stories about her influence over the king, often describing her as someone who disrupted the natural order of royal life. Some called her a temptress, others a usurper, and many believed she brought danger not only to Catherine, but to the kingdom itself. These impressions spread quickly, shaped as much by fear as by fact. Arguments about the two women filled marketplaces, churchyards, and taverns. Men and women who rarely discussed politics found themselves speaking passionately about the king's marriage. Some insisted Catherine had been wronged, pointing to her years of service to England and her steadfast adherence to faith. Others argued that the kingdom needed an heir, that the future of the realm might depend on a new marriage. Every opinion carried personal weight, reflecting anxieties about religious identity, national stability, and the unpredictable force of the king's desires. Written material intensified these divisions. Pamphlets circulated through London and beyond, often anonymous, and filled with accusations about Anne's character. Letters carried news that blended truth with speculation, repeating claims of manipulation, sorcery, or moral decay. Few people questioned the accuracy of these stories. The emotion behind them mattered more than evidence. Catherine was portrayed as a woman abandoned unfairly by a king who owed her gratitude. Anne was depicted as the cause of this abandonment, whether through calculated ambition or inappropriate influence. The simplicity of these narratives made them easy to repeat and difficult to challenge. Inside the court, the weight of public sentiment flowed into daily routines. Servants who once carried themselves confidently in Catherine's presence began to hesitate, uncertain whether expressing loyalty to her might place them in danger. Those who supported Anne behaved cautiously as well, aware that many regarded her rise with suspicion. Court officials monitored the tone of the kingdom closely, aware that any misstep could lead to unrest. Each decision the king made, however small, was judged by the public through the lens of this conflict between two women who had become symbols of competing visions for England's future. Foreign ambassadors documented these shifts with meticulous attention. Their letters described how the population reacted to the evolving crisis, often highlighting the contrast between the public's devotion to Catherine and the limited acceptance of Anne. Reports travelled across Europe, shaping the opinions of rulers who watched England's turmoil with concern. Some viewed the situation as a personal dispute, while others recognized the deeper implications for religion and diplomacy. Regardless of interpretation, the conflict captured the attention of every nation with ties to the English crown. In private homes, the division reached families who had no connection to the court. Conversations at mealtimes drifted toward the subject of Catherine's treatment or Anne's influence. Mothers discussed the uncertainty of the kingdom's future. Fathers debated the king's decisions, and children listened quietly, sensing the tension without fully understanding its cause. Households that once spoke confidently about England's stability now found themselves speculating about changes that could alter their lives in ways they could not predict. Anne's coronation did little to quiet the unrest. Many attended the ceremony out of obligation rather than celebration, their expressions revealing doubt rather than loyalty. To them, the transition felt incomplete, as though the kingdom had accepted a queen whose legitimacy existed only in the eyes of the king. Even as she took her place beside Henry, murmurs of disapproval continued to pass through the crowds. Catherine's supporters maintained their loyalty with a determination that bordered on defiance, refusing to accept the loss of the queen they trusted. Inside the palace, Anne carried herself with composure, aware that the crown she wore did not silence the voices condemning her. Each decision she made was met with scrutiny, each appearance inspected for signs of weakness or arrogance. Her influence reshaped the court, but it did not erase the resentment that had grown during her rise. Catherine's absence did not remove her presence. The memory of her dignity lingered. Becoming a quiet form of opposition, neither the king nor Anne could fully escape. Across the kingdom, the conflict between the two women persisted beyond the legal and political decisions that had settled their positions. The tensions seeped into religious practices, personal beliefs, and daily routines, becoming part of the atmosphere of the era. Catherine symbolized loyalty to the past. Anne symbolized the uncertain promise of change, and the people carried these symbols with them in everything they spoke, believed, or feared. Public sentiment hardened into lines that refused to soften, settling across the kingdom with a weight that could not be dismissed. The shift in loyalty pressed quietly against every corner of daily life, urging people to rethink where their trust belonged. Something unspoken began to move within that tension, hinting at consequences waiting beyond anything either woman had yet faced. Influence within Henry VIII's court often took forms that did not wear crowns or sit beside the king during ceremonies. Two women, Elizabeth Blount and Mary Boleyn, embodied this hidden power. Their positions lacked the public authority that came with queenship, yet their connections to the king shaped alliances, redirected ambitions, and opened pathways for their families. They moved behind the visible structures of the court, leaving traces in decisions that appeared, on the surface, to come solely from the king's will. Elizabeth Blount's presence marked one of the earliest examples of how a royal mistress could shift the balance of influence without holding a title. Her relationship with Henry emerged quietly, without the intense controversy that later surrounded Anne Boleyn. She brought him a son, an outcome that carried immense symbolic weight in a kingdom troubled by the absence of a male heir. Although the child could not inherit the throne, the birth demonstrated the king's ability to father sons, subtly redirecting blame for the lack of a legitimate male heir away from him and toward Catherine. This shift mattered deeply in a society where lineage determined the stability of the realm. Elizabeth herself did not seek a crown, and her departure from court after the child's birth appeared tranquil. Yet the advantages secured by her family lingered long after she withdrew from the centre of power. Mary Boleyn's influence developed through a different pattern. Her connection to the king preceded Anne's rise, and though it did not capture his attention with lasting intensity, it provided the Boleyn family with an early foothold at court. Her family understood the political value of proximity, using Mary's relationship with the king to strengthen their status. The ease with which they navigated the shifting dynamics of the palace revealed how accustomed they were to recognizing opportunity. The reputation Mary carried did not elevate her into a position of public honor, but the influence that followed her name became part of the foundation upon which Anne later built her ascent. Both women existed within the delicate boundaries of favor, visible enough to gain advantage, invisible enough to be replaced without public outcry. They were not burdened by the demands placed upon queens, yet they experienced the instability that came with depending on the king's interest. Their value to their families lay not in their titles but in their proximity to authority, and that proximity came with a price. They lived within a system where affection, desire, and political calculation intertwined so tightly that it became difficult to separate one from the other. Their roles were neither celebrated nor condemned openly, but they shaped currents of power that influenced the greater conflicts surrounding Catherine and Anne. Court factions recognized the usefulness of these women and acted accordingly. Families seeking advancement observed how the fortunes of the Blounts and the Boleyns shifted after their daughters' relationships with Henry. They learned that influence did not require public acknowledgement, it required access. Ministers adjusted their behavior in subtle ways, offering courtesies that aligned them with those who moved closest to the king. Even the smallest gesture could suggest a preference, and preferences mattered in a court where alliances changed direction with the slightest alteration of the king's attention. Rumours followed Elizabeth and Mary, shaped not by scandal alone, but by the public's sense of unease about how power operated behind closed doors. Stories circulated about special privileges granted to their families, promotions given without clear explanation, and wealth that grew from connections rather than service. The people recognized that the lines between private relationships and political advantage blurred easily. These women did not command armies or influence doctrine, yet their presence contributed to the atmosphere of competition that defined the court during Catherine and Anne's conflict. Their experiences revealed how deeply family interests intertwined with individual lives. Neither Elizabeth nor Mary existed in isolation. Each was part of a larger network of ambition. Their families interpreted their relationships not as personal matters, but as strategic openings. Success for one daughter could bring stability to an entire lineage, while the loss of royal favour threatened to unravel years of careful advancement. This dynamic placed pressure on both women to navigate their roles without missteps, knowing that mistakes carried consequences beyond themselves. The court's reaction to these relationships demonstrated how fragile positions could be. Elizabeth's quiet withdrawal illustrated how a family could secure long-term benefits without remaining in the centre of uncertainty. Mary's later decline, overshadowed by her sister's rise, revealed how quickly fortunes could shift. The same people who once sought her favour distanced themselves when Anne became the preferred figure. Old connections faded, replaced by new alliances shaped by the political momentum surrounding Anne's ascent. Despite their differing paths, both women contributed to the complex web of influence that defined Henry's reign. They existed in the margins, yet their lives reflected the larger story of a court driven by desire, ambition, and the relentless pursuit of advantage. Their presence reminded the kingdom that power did not always announce itself. Sometimes it moved quietly, carried by those who appeared to have no official authority, yet shaped the environment from which decisions emerged. Influence flowed around these women in ways that did not depend on titles, leaving behind traces of ambition that lingered long after their roles faded. The shifts created by their connections shaped expectations within families and factions, binding personal histories to political outcomes. A deeper current was beginning to build beneath these movements, signaling that the foundations of power in the court were entering a more volatile stage. Desire moved through Henry VIII's court with a force that reshaped alliances, redirected ambition, and elevated individuals who might otherwise have remained unnoticed. Physical attraction, often treated as a private matter in ordinary households, became a political instrument inside the palace. The king's attention could lift a woman into a position where her presence altered the course of national affairs. Those who understood this dynamic recognized how closely the king's personal inclinations connected to the broader machinery of the state. The court did not discourage this connection. It adapted to it, observing where the king's gaze settled and adjusting itself accordingly. Women placed near the king learned quickly that their survival depended on more than beauty. Appearances provided an initial opening, but beauty alone could not sustain influence within an environment defined by scrutiny, envy, and shifting expectations. Intelligence became essential, not in the form of bold declarations, but through a quiet, measured awareness of how power moved. A single miscalculation could disrupt the delicate balance between favour and danger. Each gesture, each expression, each proximity to the king carried meaning that others interpreted with precision. The line between admiration and threat remained thin, and those who crossed it seldom realized their mistake until it was too late. Religious expectations added another layer of risk. Henry's court stood at the center of a nation, wrestling with questions of doctrine and authority. A woman who attracted the king's attention inevitably found herself entangled in these disputes. Her faith, her conduct, and her associations became subjects of intense evaluation. Supporters interpreted her presence as a sign of divine favor or a path toward reform. Critics viewed her influence as moral decay or spiritual corruption. The tension between earthly desire and religious obligation created a pressure that surrounded every woman connected to the king, pushing her into a space where personal survival became inseparable from political consequence. The court watched these developments with a mixture of fascination and caution. People whispered about the king's preferences, speculating how a single decision might reshape the structure of power. Ministers behaved carefully around women who appeared favoured, aware that one misplaced word could shift their fortunes. Families manoeuvred to position their daughters within the king's view, understanding that a moment of interest might bring decades of advantage. Each household carried hopes, shaped not by virtue or lineage alone, but by the unpredictable nature of desire within a royal setting. Some women navigated this environment with subtlety, maintaining a presence that did not provoke open hostility. Others attracted attention too quickly, drawing envy before they understood the dangers. A single rumor could erode a woman's standing faster than any formal accusation. The image of impropriety, real or imagined, became a weapon used freely by factions seeking advantage. Those who wished to undermine a rival needed only to hint at misconduct. Once the idea took hold, it spread through the court with a speed that left little room for defense. The court seldom waited for evidence. Suspicion alone was enough to cause isolation. Henry's expectations amplified these risks. He demanded loyalty, purity, and obedience, while simultaneously elevating women through desire. The contradiction placed them in a position where they were judged by standards impossible to maintain. They were expected to display charm without arrogance, intelligence without challenge, and devotion without the appearance of manipulation. Any deviation from these expectations invited scrutiny. A gesture interpreted as too bold suggested ambition. A gesture too restrained suggested disinterest. In either case, the consequences could be severe. The threat of execution hung over the court as a reminder of how quickly affection could turn to condemnation. Henry had already demonstrated that a queen's life depended entirely on his trust. Those who witnessed past downfalls carried that memory with them, shaping their behaviour around the fear that a similar fate could reach anyone who failed to meet the king's expectations. This fear did not result in silence. It resulted in calculated caution. Women near the king learned to monitor not only their own actions, but also the movements of those around them, aware that betrayal frequently came from familiar places. This environment produced a form of survival that demanded both outward composure and internal vigilance. Women who thrived did so by reading the court with the precision of scholars, recognizing patterns of behavior and adjusting accordingly. Their intelligence operated quietly, expressed not through argument, but through awareness. They avoided unnecessary attention while positioning themselves to remain relevant. Their success depended on recognizing when to advance and when to withdraw, when to speak and when to remain silent. Influence held under these conditions became fragile, constantly threatened by forces beyond personal control. Observers outside the court misunderstood these dynamics, often oversimplifying the roles of the women involved. They saw beauty and desire, but overlooked the complexity required to maintain a place within the palace. They judged women harshly for their influence, yet ignored the pressures that shaped their actions. Those who lived within the court understood that desire, morality, and power existed in constant tension. A queen's survival required more than the king's affection. It required navigating a structure designed to challenge her at every turn. In this world, the throne itself carried an invisible cost. Every woman who approached it understood that her future depended not only on the king's passion, but on her ability to withstand the shifting alliances that defined his reign. Some rose with extraordinary speed, lifted by a combination of charm and circumstance. Others fell abruptly, undone by the slightest misjudgment. No one held their place securely, for the same desires that elevated them could erase them without warning. Survival at court rested on a blend of attraction and strategy, shaped by forces far larger than personal choice. The pressure surrounding these women intensified as expectations tightened across the kingdom, pushing them toward decisions that carried consequences beyond their control. Something darker began to stir within these shifting lines, hinting at the dangers waiting for those who dared to rise too close to the king. Jane Seymour entered Henry VIII's court with a presence that drew far less noise than the women who came before her. She carried herself with a restraint that contrasted sharply with the turbulence surrounding Anne Boleyn. Her quiet manner, her modest behaviour, and her adherence to religious tradition made her appear safe in a setting that had grown weary of conflict. Observers noted the calm she projected, seeing in her a reminder of an older ideal of queenship. Her demeanour alone did not guarantee influence, yet it softened the atmosphere around her and created space for the king to imagine stability after years of upheaval. Her family recognised the value of this impression. They understood that a king fatigued by controversy would be drawn to someone who offered serenity rather than challenge. Jane's conduct aligned precisely with what they believed the court now required: obedience without fragility, devotion without ambition, and presence without spectacle. These qualities positioned her as the opposite of Anne at a moment when the king's dissatisfaction had begun to deepen. The contrast shaped the narrative surrounding her, suggesting that she represented a restoration of order rather than another disruption. Within the palace walls, subtle adjustments reflected her rising significance. Courtiers who once devoted themselves to Anne began to shift their attention, careful not to appear opportunistic while still acknowledging the possibility of change. Servants observed Jane's interactions with the king with quiet interest, recognizing the pattern in his behavior. Ministers measured their words around her, aware that even the faintest sign of the king's favor required strategic caution. Jane did not appear to seek influence, yet the atmosphere responded to her presence as though she were already part of a larger transition. As Anne's position weakened, Jane's steadiness became more pronounced. She did not provoke debate, nor did she inspire divisions as Anne had. Instead, she moved through the court with a composure that made her difficult to challenge. Those who supported her described her as virtuous and obedient, qualities that aligned with traditional expectations of queenship. Her detractors remained quiet, aware that anything they said might conflict with the image that was forming around her. Her silence created an environment in which others shaped the meaning of her presence, giving her influence without requiring her participation. Her marriage to Henry marked a shift in the emotional landscape of the court. After the executions and upheavals that preceded it, the ceremony carried a subdued tone. People watched not with excitement, but with cautious curiosity, uncertain whether this union would bring relief or simply another chapter of instability. Yet Jane adjusted to her new role with the same restraint that had drawn Henry to her. Her behaviour did not provoke conflict. Instead, it fostered a calm that the court had not experienced in years. The birth of her son altered everything. Edward's arrival provided the kingdom with the legitimate male heir it had long awaited, reinforcing the stability Henry believed he had restored through his marriage to Jane. The birth validated his choices in a way no political argument could achieve. Ministers expressed relief, foreign ambassadors adjusted their reports, and the public responded with gratitude. Jane, who had been treated with courtesy before, now received reverence. Her son's existence strengthened the Tudor line and secured her place within its history. Yet the moment of triumph did not last. Jane's health declined rapidly after childbirth, leaving the court in a state of unsettled quiet. Physicians attempted remedies familiar to the period, but none eased her deterioration. Those who attended her observed the fading of a woman who had carried immense expectations yet held power for only a brief period. The court, still recovering from previous losses, braced itself for another shift. Henry's behaviour conveyed a mixture of shock and resignation, as though the stability he sought had slipped beyond reach again. Her death left the kingdom in an atmosphere shaped less by outcry and more by muted sorrow. People mourned her not for a long reign, but for the brief sense of calm she had brought. Her passing reinforced the fragility of queenship under Henry, showing how even those who fulfilled expectations perfectly remained vulnerable. The court adjusted quickly out of necessity, yet the absence she left behind carried a weight that lingered. Her story became another reminder that proximity to the king offered no protection from the unpredictable forces surrounding him. Jane's role in history crystallized around the son she left behind. Her influence, though short-lived, reached far into the future through the political security her child provided. Families aligned themselves around Edward's existence, seeing his survival as essential to the realm. Ministers recalibrated their plans, and the public interpreted his birth as a sign that England might finally settle into a more certain direction. Jane herself became a symbol of quiet fulfillment, remembered more for what she delivered than for the choices she made. Her life revealed the unique position of a queen who neither provoked scandal nor reshaped the court through ambition. Instead, she navigated her role with a calmness that shielded her from immediate danger, yet could not protect her from fate. Her story illustrated how even the most carefully balanced presence remained subject to the demands of a kingdom defined by Henry's desires and the pressures of succession. She entered history softly, left it abruptly, and remained in its memory as the queen who achieved what others could not. Her quiet rise and sudden departure settled into the court with a weight that altered its rhythm, leaving a sense of unfinished calm behind her. The birth of an heir reshaped expectations across the realm, drawing new lines of ambition around the child she left behind. A muted tension drifted through the corridors, hinting at developments waiting beyond the reach of the peace she briefly created. Anne Boleyn's absence did not settle cleanly into the silence that followed her execution. Her presence lingered in the court in ways that neither ceremony nor proclamation could erase. Henry carried the memory of her with a tension that revealed itself through shifts in mood, sudden bursts of determination, or moments of quiet retreat. His fascination with her had shaped years of conflict, and her downfall carried a force that he could not entirely distance himself from. The combination of affection and resentment that defined their relationship continued to affect the decisions he made long after she was gone. Those who observed him closely noticed the patterns. There were days when the king seemed burdened by a recollection he did not speak of, moving through the palace with a heaviness that suggested unresolved emotion. At other times, he displayed a hardened conviction that appeared to rise from the need to justify the choices he had made. Anne had become part of the fabric of his reign, intertwined with the religious and political upheaval that had transformed England. Removing her from the present did not free him from the echoes of that transformation. Elizabeth, left behind as the living reminder of Anne's rise and fall, grew up under a watchful atmosphere shaped by caution rather than tenderness. Her position within the royal family shifted according to the king's mood and the political needs of the moment. Though she was acknowledged as his daughter, the circumstances of her birth and her mother's fate cast a shadow over her early years. People within the court treated her respectfully but carefully, aware that proximity to her name carried risks. Her education continued. Her presence was maintained. Yet there remained a quiet uncertainty about how the king wished her to be regarded. The child displayed an alertness that many noted, absorbing the movements and tones of the adults around her with unusual clarity. She learned early that survival required awareness rather than innocence. The behavior of those who interacted with her revealed as much about her mother's enduring presence as it did about their views of the future. Some offered subtle support, recognizing potential in the girl that exceeded her status. Others kept their distance, unwilling to align themselves with the legacy of a queen whose fall had been both dramatic and deeply political. Elizabeth lived at the intersection of caution and expectation, carrying a name that remained unresolved within the court. Anne's influence persisted in the experiences of the queens who followed her. Each woman who entered Henry's orbit carried an awareness of the dangers that had destroyed Anne. Her downfall remained a point of reference, a warning marked into the memory of the palace. Jane Seymour's behavior reflected that awareness, shaping her quiet approach to power. Later queens adjusted themselves carefully, monitoring their actions and controlling their words. Understanding that Henry's tolerance had limits sharpened by past events, the court understood that the same forces capable of elevating a woman to the height of influence could erase her with equal speed. Diplomats referenced Anne's fate when discussing England's internal shifts. Her death signaled to foreign courts that Henry's decisions were governed by emotion as much as strategy. Reports described a king who reacted strongly to perceived threats, whether personal or political. The execution of a queen sent a message that could not be softened. Alliances abroad adapted to this reality, treating the English court with a mixture of caution and calculation. Anne remained part of these assessments long after her physical absence, shaping how England was interpreted beyond its borders. Within England itself, public memory of Anne split along lines of loyalty and belief. Some regarded her as the source of religious reform and the break from Rome. Others saw her as the cause of instability, linking her rise to the erosion of traditional structures. These interpretations continued to influence attitudes toward the monarchy and the church. Her story became part of a larger narrative, determining how people understood the transformation of their kingdom. Even those who had never seen her felt the consequences of decisions made in her name or against her. Servants and officials who remained from Anne's time occasionally recalled her presence in quiet remarks, noting the intensity she brought to the court and the speed with which circumstances turned against her. Their recollections appeared not as expressions of sentiment, but as evidence of how volatile life near the king could become. Anne's execution had been justified publicly through charges of treason and misconduct. Yet privately, many understood that her fall reflected the broader instability of a court shaped by rivalry, ambition, and shifting alliances. Her legacy endured through Elizabeth most visibly, but also through the anxiety her fate caused for those who followed. Queens who stood beside Henry after her faced expectations sharpened by fear. They knew that perfection did not guarantee safety, and that compliance did not erase vulnerability. Anne's rise had demonstrated what ambition could achieve. Her fall revealed the limits of that ambition within a system controlled by the king's will. Her memory remained a boundary against which future queens measured their behaviour. The court adapted to her absence, but the imprint she left remained embedded in its structure. Policies continued to reflect the consequences of her influence, and the children she left behind carried the weight of her story in ways that extended far beyond their private lives. Anne existed in conversations, rumours, warnings, and reflections, becoming part of the court's ongoing consciousness, even as new queens attempted to create their own identities. Her memory lingered through halls that could not forget the upheaval she caused, settling into the court as a presence that refused to fade. The shadow of her legacy stretched across decisions, expectations, and the lives of those who navigated the spaces she once occupied. Quiet currents within the court hinted that the influence tied to her name had not reached its final point of consequence. Anne of Cleves entered the English court as part of a strategy designed to strengthen ties with the Protestant states of Germany. Her marriage to Henry VIII formed the core of this diplomatic effort, intended to reinforce England's position within a continent marked by shifting alliances and religious divisions. Ambassadors arranged the match with careful negotiation, believing that the union would signal a new direction for England's political relationships. Anne travelled across the sea, carrying the weight of a decision shaped not by affection but by international necessity. Her arrival in England presented a reality that differed sharply from the expectations built around her portrait. Observers noted her modest demeanour, her limited English, and the simplicity of her behaviour. These qualities did not align with the image Henry had imagined, and his reaction to seeing her for the first time spread through the court with unsettling speed. The king's disappointment became a matter of whispered conversation, repeated by servants and courtiers who sensed the tension forming even before the marriage ceremony took place. Though the alliance continued as planned, the atmosphere surrounding it lost the stability required for a lasting union. The wedding proceeded with formality rather than celebration. Those who attended recognized that the king's dissatisfaction would eventually shape the future of the marriage. Yet no one attempted to intervene. The political importance of the union demanded that it be completed, even as speculation circulated about how long it would endure. Henry's discomfort remained evident, creating an emotional distance that Anne could neither bridge nor influence. Her inexperience with English customs deepened the divide, leaving her without the support needed to adapt to her new position. Inside the palace, Anne adjusted herself quietly to the routines of queenship. She performed the duties expected of her, greeting visitors, maintaining decorum, and presenting an image of cooperation. Her conduct displayed no ambition, no attempt to assert influence, and no behavior that could provoke conflict. She moved through the court with a calm that revealed her willingness to accept her circumstances. Yet the king's response remained unchanged. His irritation grew, supported by advisers who recognized that the diplomatic value of the marriage had diminished as political conditions shifted in Europe. The decision to annul the marriage emerged quickly after these developments. Henry pursued the separation with determination, citing reasons that reflected his dissatisfaction rather than any political necessity. The court prepared for another transition, aware that the king's personal preferences held greater weight than the alliances crafted by diplomacy. Yet the tone surrounding Anne differed significantly from the hostility that had characterized previous dissolutions. There were no accusations of treason, no charges of immorality, and no public attempts to discredit her. The process unfolded with a quiet efficiency unusual for Henry's court. Anne accepted the annulment with composure that surprised many who observed her. She showed no protest, no resistance, and no attempt to retain her position. This response altered the atmosphere surrounding her, reducing tension and preventing the surge of hostility that had followed the downfall of other queens. Her willingness to cooperate allowed the court to transition without disruption, and her departure from the throne occurred with a calmness that reflected both practicality and caution. After the annulment, Henry designated her as the king's sister, granting her estates, status, and a position within the royal household that afforded her comfort without political responsibility. She became a familiar presence within the realm, participating in ceremonies, visiting the court on special occasions, and maintaining cordial relations with the king. Her interactions with Henry displayed an ease that contrasted with the turbulence of his marriages. She remained respectful, and he responded with a measure of warmth rare in his treatment of former wives. The court observed this unusual relationship with curiosity. Anne's position allowed her to live securely without entering the dangerous sphere of influence that had destroyed others. She faced no pressure to produce heirs, no expectation to manage religious changes, and no threat of accusations. Her existence within England became defined by stability rather than ambition. Courtiers treated her with respect, aware that the king valued her cooperation and held no resentment toward her. She became a figure who moved through the palace without provoking factions, a rarity in an environment shaped by competition. Her life after the annulment illustrated an alternative path for women connected to Henry. While others faced execution, isolation, or political turmoil, Anne found a space free from the hazards of power. She maintained her household, participated in festivities, and lived with a degree of independence that few queens possessed. Her ability to navigate the transition from royal consort to respected member of the king's circle demonstrated a resilience grounded in acceptance rather than influence. Anne remained in England for the rest of her life, becoming one of the few women connected to Henry who experienced neither fear nor scandal. Her presence served as a reminder that survival within the Tudor court sometimes required yielding rather than resisting. She departed the throne without conflict and secured an existence defined by comfort rather than danger. Her story stood in stark contrast to those who came before and after her, revealing how adaptability could protect a woman within a system governed by unpredictable forces. Her removal from the throne settled quietly into the rhythm of the court, leaving no fractures behind her and no enemies seeking her downfall. The ease with which she adapted to her altered status shifted the court's understanding of survival, revealing a rare instance of calm in Henry's turbulent private world. A deeper current began to stir beneath this temporary stability, hinting that the calm surrounding her would not extend to the queen who came after. Expectation within Henry VIII's court rested heavily on the production of a male heir, and this single requirement shaped the fate of every queen who entered the king's orbit. The absence of a son carried consequences that extended far beyond disappointment. It created an atmosphere of judgment that reached into the most private parts of a queen's life, turning her physical condition into a matter of national urgency. The pressure did not arise from personal desire alone. It reflected a political system that placed the future of the realm on one child's existence. Failure, regardless of reason, became a mark that no queen could escape. Courtiers observed the progression of each queen's pregnancies with an intensity that bordered on surveillance. Every sign of hope invited speculation, and every sign of trouble fed rumours that drifted through the palace. The court spoke of miscarriages and stillbirths with a mixture of sympathy and calculation, knowing that the king's reaction could determine the queen's stability. Men and women who held no medical understanding felt entitled to interpret the meaning of each outcome, often attributing blame where none could be proven. These reactions revealed the extent to which a queen's worth had become tied to her ability to provide a son. Henry himself displayed a pattern of expectation that grew sharper with each disappointment. Though he acknowledged his daughters, his focus remained fixed on securing a male successor. This insistence amplified the pressure on every queen who followed Catherine of Aragon. Many within the court believed that the kingdom's stability depended on fulfilling this requirement, interpreting any failure as a threat to England's future. The king's desire merged with political anxiety, transforming a personal matter into an issue that defined the balance of power. The physical and emotional strain placed on the queens did not go unnoticed. They were expected to maintain composure even when pregnancies ended in loss, and they were judged harshly when hope dissolved into grief. Advisors monitored their behavior, interpreting fatigue, illness, or anxiety as indicators of weakness. The court rarely considered the toll these experiences took on the women themselves. Instead, queens were evaluated through the narrow lens of succession, their identities reduced to their potential to produce an heir. Families connected to the queens felt the implications of these pressures as well. Their fortunes rose and fell with the success or failure of a pregnancy, creating tension that radiated outward through alliances. A queen's inability to secure a son threatened not only her position, but also the influence of her relatives. Ambitious families responded by strategizing ways to protect themselves, either by reinforcing their support for the queen or by quietly preparing for her replacement. The uncertainty created an environment where loyalty depended on circumstance rather than conviction. Ministers and ambassadors followed these developments closely, aware that international relations could shift depending on the outcome of a single birth. Their letters reflected both caution and anticipation, reporting on the Queen's condition and the mood of the court. They understood that a male heir would strengthen England's political standing, while continued uncertainty would leave the kingdom vulnerable. Expectations surrounding childbirth shaped the tone of diplomacy, revealing how deeply domestic matters influenced foreign perceptions. Rumours often deepened the burden placed on queens. Miscarriages were interpreted as divine disfavour, moral failure, or evidence of conspiracy. Some accused queens of failing to conduct themselves properly, while others suggested that political opponents interfered to weaken their position. These narratives spread quickly, fueled by the court's appetite for intrigue. The women caught in the centre of these stories carried their grief in silence, aware that any emotional display might be used against them. The fear of failure created circumstances where queens monitored their behaviour with relentless care. Their diets, activities, and interactions came under scrutiny, often dictated by advisors who believed they understood the requirements for a successful pregnancy. Queens found themselves confined by both physical and social restrictions, attempting to balance expectations that offered little room for autonomy. Their lives became a sequence of cautious steps, shaped by a fear of consequences they could not entirely control. Even after childbirth, uncertainty persisted. The survival of infants in this period was precarious, and a child's death reopened the pressure that a queen briefly escaped. The fragility of life added another layer of anxiety, reminding everyone within the court that stability could disappear at any moment. The uncertainty magnified the tension between hope and despair, reinforcing the vulnerability of queens whose futures depended on forces beyond their influence. Henry's responses to these circumstances varied, but the pattern remained unmistakable. Queens who failed to provide a son found themselves at risk, either through annulment, accusation, or abandonment. The consequences differed in severity, yet the underlying cause remained consistent. The expectation for a male heir became a measure not only of a queen's success, but of her moral worth in the eyes of the court. This perception shaped the fates of Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, and others who followed, leaving a trail of personal and political devastation. The court adjusted to each transition with a mixture of resignation and anticipation. People understood that the burden placed on queens would continue until a secure male heir existed. This expectation influenced the selection of future queens, the ambitions of powerful families, and the strategies of ministers who sought to navigate the king's shifting emotional and political landscape. The pressure to produce a son settled over every queen with a weight that refused to ease, directing choices and determining futures in ways none of them could escape. Expectations tightened across the court, shaping alliances and altering the quiet routines that governed daily life. Tension deepened within those corridors, hinting at developments waiting beyond the reach of the women forced to endure this burden. Catherine Howard entered Henry VIII's life at a moment when the court had grown exhausted by tension and loss. Her youth stood out in an environment shaped by caution and political calculation. She moved with an ease that reflected her limited understanding of the dangers surrounding her. Courtiers observed her with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism, noting the contrast between her vitality and the king's declining health. Her presence created a shift in atmosphere, not through influence or strategy, but through the brightness she carried into rooms defined by years of conflict. Henry responded to her presence with a renewed energy that surprised those who watched him closely. His attention turned toward her with a level of affection he had not shown in years. Catherine became the focus of his admiration, her youth acting as both a comfort and a distraction. She offered him an emotional reprieve from the disappointments that had shaped his marriages. Those within the court recognized the king's vulnerability and adjusted their behavior carefully, aware that any slight toward Catherine would be interpreted as an affront to him. Her family recognized the advantage her sudden rise provided, and they attempted to position themselves accordingly. Yet Catherine lacked the experience required to navigate the expectations placed upon her. She had entered the court without the training or discipline that guided other queens, and her background offered little preparation for the scrutiny that accompanied her new role. Her demeanor, though charming, did not align with the rigid standards of conduct imposed on women near the king. This disconnect soon created tension between her spontaneous behavior and the stability required of a royal consort. As queen, Catherine struggled to adapt to the demands of a household that monitored every movement. Courtiers observed her actions with increased precision, noting details that might be interpreted as signs of impropriety. The king's affection shielded her temporarily, but the atmosphere around her remained fragile. She relied on familiarity rather than caution, treating her new life as an extension of the one she had left behind. This approach proved dangerous in a court where perception held as much power as fact. Rumors began quietly, small remarks, subtle movements, and memories from her earlier years resurfaced in conversations among those who sought advantage. Ministers who held no loyalty to her family examined these whispers carefully, recognizing their potential. The court had witnessed the downfall of queens before, and individuals who understood the patterns anticipated how accusations could be used to shift influence. Catherine's behavior offered opportunities for speculation, and speculation quickly became evidence in the minds of those who wished to remove her. The investigation into her conduct unfolded with a speed that revealed how fragile her position had always been. Advisors gathered testimony from people connected to her earlier life, building a case that portrayed her as morally unfit for queenship. The intensity of the accusations increased with each statement, creating a narrative that the court found increasingly difficult to ignore. Catherine, unaware of the full extent of the danger, appeared unprepared for the severity of the charges forming around her. When the accusations reached the king, the atmosphere shifted immediately. Henry's response reflected not only betrayal, but humiliation. The affection he had shown Catherine became a point of vulnerability, and the court responded to his anger with swift alignment. Individuals who once treated Catherine with courtesy distanced themselves, unwilling to risk association with someone now perceived as compromised. Her youth, once seen as charming, became interpreted as recklessness. Her inexperience became evidence of guilt. As the investigation deepened, the court entered a period of tense observation. Ministers debated the appropriate course of action, but most recognized that the outcome was already determined by the king's reaction. Catherine's fate moved rapidly toward a conclusion that mirrored earlier tragedies within the Tudor court. Her attempts to seek mercy, though recorded, held little influence. The momentum of the accusations, combined with the king's resolve, offered no room for reconsideration. Her execution unfolded with a solemnity that reflected the gravity of the charges. Those who witnessed the event observed not only the end of her brief life, but the collapse of a woman who had entered the court without understanding the environment she would face. Her death reinforced the dangers surrounding women who occupied positions near the king. It demonstrated how swiftly favor could dissolve and how quickly allies could become strangers when survival required distance. After her death, the court resumed its routines with a muted sense of recognition. Her story became another reminder of the volatility that defined Henry's reign. Catherine's brief time as queen left little political impact, yet her downfall influenced how future consorts viewed their roles. Her youth and inexperience revealed vulnerabilities that others would attempt to avoid. Ministers reassessed the court's structure, adjusting their strategies to align with the king's shifting expectations. Catherine's legacy persisted not through influence, but through caution. Her life demonstrated that affection from the king offered no guarantee of safety, and that failure to meet the expectations surrounding queenship carried consequences far beyond personal loss. Her story became part of the evolving narrative that shaped the behavior of those who followed, reminding them that innocence did not protect against the weight of accusation. Her rise and collapse passed through the court with a force that left behind a quiet sense of inevitability, confirming once more the instability faced by women near the king. The atmosphere surrounding her memory settled into a lesson about vulnerability, drawing lines that future queens would approach with greater caution. Pressure within the palace deepened in response, signaling that the struggle for survival had entered a harsher phase than before. Catherine Parr entered Henry VIII's court, carrying a combination of experience and restraint that set her apart from the queens who came before her. She was older than Henry's previous wives, familiar with the responsibilities of marriage, and aware of the dangers that accompanied proximity to power. Her intelligence, though quietly expressed, gave her an advantage in navigating the unpredictable environment of the Tudor court. She understood that survival required composure rather than defiance, and this understanding shaped the way she moved through her new life. From the beginning, observers noted her capacity to maintain balance within a court accustomed to conflict. Her demeanor offered no provocation, yet it did not suggest weakness. She approached each situation with a calmness that discouraged hostility and eased suspicion. Ministers and advisors who had grown wary of strong-willed queens found her reassuring. They recognized that her presence did not threaten their authority, yet her judgment remained clear enough to support the king when necessary. This balance created a sense of stability that had been absent for many years. Her influence extended most visibly into the education of Henry's children. Catherine engaged with them attentively, encouraging their studies and ensuring consistent intellectual development. Her approach contrasted sharply with the uncertainty that had shaped their earlier lives. She provided structure without imposing rigidity, guiding them in ways that reflected her belief in learning as a foundation for personal growth. The children responded to her presence with trust, sensing the steady guidance she offered without seeking recognition. Elizabeth and Edward benefited particularly from her attention. She supported Elizabeth's intellectual curiosity, allowing her access to texts that broadened her understanding of history, language, and governance. Her involvement with Edward emphasized discipline and clarity, preparing him for responsibilities far greater than his age suggested. Catherine's role in their lives did not expand through authority but through consistent presence, shaping the framework of their education with a quiet influence that extended beyond the schoolroom. Her religious beliefs, though aligned with Protestant ideals, did not disrupt the fragile balance of the court. She maintained her convictions with careful restraint, ensuring that her practices did not undermine Henry's authority. Her support for reform appeared through subtle encouragement rather than open advocacy. She commissioned translations of religious texts and engaged in theological study. Yet she avoided public displays that might provoke scrutiny. Her approach reflected a deep awareness of the risks attached to religious debate in a kingdom still transitioning between doctrines. The king responded to her steadiness with an unusual degree of trust. Catherine's presence offered him intellectual companionship, as well as domestic order. She listened to his concerns with patience, contributed to discussions with clarity, and adapted to his shifting moods without appearing submissive. Her behavior reinforced his perception of her as a supportive partner rather than a political threat. Yet this trust remained delicate, as all trust within the Tudor court did. Those who opposed religious reform watched her carefully, searching for signs that her influence exceeded her role. Tension eventually surfaced when her religious activities drew the attention of conservative factions within the court. They viewed her study of scripture and her correspondence with reformers as evidence of disobedience. Rumors circulated that she challenged the king's authority, a dangerous accusation in an environment where dissent had led to executions. These factions sought to use her convictions against her, hoping to weaken her influence and reassert traditional structures within the court. Their strategy mirrored earlier attempts to remove queens who appeared threatening, though Catherine's conduct differed significantly from her predecessors. When the accusations reached the king, Catherine responded with the same composure that had guided her throughout her life. She framed her studies as expressions of devotion rather than challenges to authority, presenting her actions in a way that eased Henry's concerns. Her approach demonstrated a precise understanding of the king's temperament. She neither apologized excessively nor defended herself with force. Instead, she aligned her intentions with Henry's expectations, allowing him to perceive her behavior as supportive rather than oppositional. This response protected her from the danger that had consumed others. Her survival after this moment marked her as distinct among Henry's queens. She avoided the extremes that had defined the fates of Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, and Catherine Howard. Her intelligence allowed her to recognize the boundaries of her influence, while her temperament enabled her to exist within those boundaries without provoking hostility. People within the court noted her ability to maintain harmony even when circumstances encouraged division. This characteristic solidified her reputation as a stabilizing figure during a turbulent period. After Henry's death, Catherine continued to demonstrate the same mixture of independence and restraint. She remarried, choosing a partner based on affection rather than political necessity, and managed her household with a level of autonomy rarely granted to former queens. Her influence on the royal children remained evident in the years that followed, shaping their intellectual and religious development. Her final years reflected a life defined not by dramatic conflict, but by quiet persistence, revealing the extent to which survival depended on understanding rather than ambition. Her legacy within the Tudor court rested on her ability to endure. She neither rose through scandal nor fell through miscalculation. Instead, she navigated the environment with a clarity that protected her from the dangers that had destroyed others. Her presence provided stability at a time when the monarchy relied heavily on those who could maintain order without compromising themselves. Her steady presence moved through the court as a rare thread of stability, leaving behind an impression shaped by endurance rather than conflict. Her influence extended quietly into the lives of the king's children, supporting changes that continued long after her time beside Henry. Unspoken shifts within the realm hinted that the burdens carried by England's queens were far from nearing their final weight. Power within Henry VIII's court did not rest solely in the crown. It moved through corridors, gathered in whispered alliances, and shifted in the hands of factions whose influence often exceeded that of the king himself. While Henry's volatility shaped the destiny of his queens, it was the factions surrounding him, ambitious families, calculating ministers, and rival religious groups, that formed the more serious threat. These factions studied the patterns of his emotions, measured the strength of their positions, and intervened at moments most advantageous to their goals. Queens who entered the court rarely understood how quickly they would become part of this machinery. Whenever a new queen appeared, these factions adjusted themselves with precision. Each group assessed her origins, her beliefs, and her family connections, attempting to determine how her presence might affect their standing. Support formed not out of loyalty, but out of usefulness. Opposition developed not from personal dislike, but from strategic calculation. A queen who arrived without a clear political alignment might be shaped into a tool. One who carried strong opinions risked becoming a threat. Every movement she made was interpreted through the lens of factional advantage. Ministers who advised the king often acted with motives that extended far beyond royal service. They recognized that the king's mood could be influenced by careful presentation of facts, selective omission, or the introduction of suspicion at critical moments. Queens who misunderstood these dynamics found themselves exposed to dangers they could neither identify nor counter. Henry's reactions, though powerful, were often triggered by information fed to him by those who sought to shape outcomes. His decisions reflected his temperament, but the direction of that temperament was frequently guided. The fall of Anne Boleyn demonstrated how swiftly factions could mobilize when they sensed opportunity. Her enemies compiled accusations, gathered testimonies of questionable validity, and delivered them at a moment when the king's dissatisfaction had reached a critical point. Catherine Howard's downfall followed a similar pattern, driven not only by the king's reaction, but by the eagerness of factions seeking to remove her family from influence. Queens seldom recognized the extent to which their survival depended on the shifting tensions beneath them. Tensions engineered by men who understood the fragility of royal favor. Religious groups also shaped the political landscape in ways that affected queens directly. Reformers and conservatives viewed each queen as either an ally or an obstacle. Her private beliefs, her educational interests, and her association with particular courtiers became signals of alignment. Catherine Parr's near downfall illustrated how theological disputes could place her in danger. Her involvement with Protestant texts alarmed conservative factions, who attempted to use their concerns to weaken her position. Her survival depended on recognizing the presence of these forces before they overwhelmed her. Families played a significant role in shaping the court's internal struggles. Each marriage introduced a new lineage seeking advantage, heightening competition between established houses and emerging rivals. Queens were frequently positioned as representatives of their family's ambitions, even when they had no desire to serve in that role. Failure to secure influence could result in sudden loss of support. While success often generated resentment, these dynamics intensified the pressure placed on queens. For any misstep threatened not only their own positions, but the fortunes of their families. The king, though powerful, often became a point around which these factions maneuvered. His emotional responses, his fears, and his desires were manipulated with remarkable skill. Those closest to him understood how to present information in ways that shaped political outcomes. Queens who interpreted the king's reactions as purely personal often underestimated the influence of those working behind the scenes. Many decisions attributed to Henry were, in reality, the product of calculated persuasion by individuals seeking to protect or expand their influence. Servants, ambassadors, and minor courtiers observed these interactions with a sense of recognition. They understood that the court's most dangerous conflicts rarely emerged from public disputes. Instead, they developed privately, concealed within conversations that left no trace. Factions operated with subtlety, creating shifts that appeared natural but were engineered with intention. Queens caught in these shifts often sensed the pressure without understanding its origin, experiencing isolation that made defense nearly impossible. This environment transformed queens into symbols rather than individuals. They carried the expectations of the factions supporting them and the suspicions of those opposing them. Their actions, however ordinary, were interpreted strategically. A gesture of kindness could be framed as manipulation. A moment of hesitation could be portrayed as deception. Their lives became subject to narratives crafted by others, narratives that often determined their destinies long before they recognized the danger. The court adapted to each new queen with unsettling speed. As soon as one marriage faltered, factions prepared for another. They anticipated changes in policy, shifts in religious emphasis, and realignments of alliances. Queens who believed they held security because of the king's affection discovered that affection did not protect them from the ambitions of those who surrounded him. Henry's emotional volatility made him susceptible to influence, increasing the power of those who knew how to guide his reactions. Over time, the pattern became unmistakable. The true threat to the queens did not lie solely in the king's capacity for sudden decisions. It emerged from the political structures that surrounded him. Structures built on competition, fear, and opportunism. Queens entered the court unaware that their lives were shaped as much by unseen forces as by the king's affection. Their successes and failures reflected the interplay of factions, whose goals often conflicted with each other and with the well-being of the women they affected. Power within the court moved in quiet currents that reached the queens long before they recognized their presence. Influence spread through alliances that shifted without warning, tightening and loosening in ways that shaped every decision surrounding the crown. Pressure inside the palace intensified again, suggesting that future queens would face dangers far more intricate than those imposed by the king alone. Influence within Henry VIII's court rarely belonged to a single individual. Behind every queen stood a family whose ambitions stretched far beyond personal advancement. These families viewed marriage to the king not as a private union, but as a political strategy capable of reshaping their futures. The Boleyns, Seymours, and Parrs exemplified this dynamic, each using their daughters' positions to secure status, authority, and survival within a court shaped by shifting loyalties. Their maneuvering demonstrated how deeply family ambition intertwined with the lives of the queens who carried their names. The Boleyn family's rise offered one of the clearest examples of how rapidly fortunes could expand when the king's attention aligned with a family's aspirations. Anne Boleyn's arrival at court provided her relatives with an opening that they pursued with precision. Her father, uncle, and extended kin positioned themselves strategically around her, seeking titles, land, and influence. As Anne gained prominence, the family's reach expanded accordingly. Their confidence grew alongside their success, creating an impression of a lineage firmly entrenched in the king's favour. Yet the same momentum that elevated them increased the severity of their downfall when the king's affection shifted. The Seymour family entered the court with a different type of calculation. They observed Anne's instability and recognized the opportunity presented by Jane Seymour's restrained demeanour. Their approach lacked the overt ambition displayed by the Boleyns, yet it contained a similar level of intent. When Jane became queen, the Seymours moved quietly into positions of significance, secure in the knowledge that her influence aligned with the king's desire for stability. Her delivery of a male heir further solidified their foundation. Edward's birth transformed the family into central figures within the Tudor line, offering them a level of authority that extended even beyond Jane's death. The Parr family's ascent followed a more measured path. Catherine Parr's intelligence and discretion made her a valuable presence within the court, and her family understood how to support her without drawing excessive attention. Their ambitions were no less significant than those of their predecessors, but their methods reflected caution. They encouraged Catherine's education and religious moderation, recognizing that these qualities appealed to the king while avoiding confrontation with conservative factions. Their strategy kept them secure during a period marked by instability for nearly every other lineage associated with the crown. Each family operated within an intricate network of alliances. They formed connections with ministers, ambassadors, and influential courtiers, creating webs of support designed to bolster their daughters' positions. These alliances expanded their reach, but also increased their vulnerability. A miscalculation by one member could jeopardize the entire structure. Families that took too much advantage of their influence attracted resentment, while those who remained passive risked losing relevance. The balance required constant attention, and even the most skilled households struggled to maintain it. The fate of these families often mirrored the trajectory of the queens they supported. When Anne Boleyn fell from favour, the collapse of the Boleyn family followed swiftly. Titles were stripped, reputations destroyed, and lives ended through execution. The speed of their downfall revealed how fragile their power had been. Their ascent had depended on Anne's success, and without her, the foundation of their influence disintegrated. Those who had once aligned themselves with the family distanced their names immediately, demonstrating the harsh reality of political dependency. The Seymours experienced the opposite pattern. Jane's death did not end their influence. Edward's life preserved it. Her brothers continued to rise, eventually controlling significant aspects of the government during Edward's minority. Yet their ambition created internal conflict, fracturing the family and contributing to their eventual decline. The very success that had empowered them became a source of instability, revealing how quickly strength could transform into vulnerability when power was concentrated within too few hands. The Parr family maintained a steadier trajectory. Catherine's survival, her influence on the royal children, and her measured approach to power ensured that her family did not face the dramatic collapses seen elsewhere. Their ambition never escalated into overreach, allowing them to retain dignity even when their authority diminished. They displayed an understanding of political rhythm, stepping forward when necessary and withdrawing when caution demanded it. Observers within the court recognized these patterns and adjusted their interactions accordingly. Courtiers aligned themselves with rising families while maintaining distance from those whose fortunes appeared uncertain. Marriage alliances, patronage, and companionship were all shaped by the perceived stability of these lineages. The actions of families behind queens affected nearly every aspect of court life, from policy decisions to personal relationships, creating a landscape where influence shifted continuously in response to royal preference. Queens caught in the center of these dynamics often bore the consequences of their family's ambitions. They faced pressure to advance their kin, maintain alliances, and preserve their positions while managing the expectations placed upon them as consorts. The demands strained their ability to navigate the court, especially when personal identity conflicted with political obligation. Their failures became family failures, and their successes amplified ambitions that sometimes exceeded their intentions. The pattern repeated throughout Henry's reign. Families rose and fell with remarkable speed, carried upward by royal favour, and cast aside when that favour evaporated. Their stories revealed a broader truth. The most dangerous place for a family in Tudor England was near the crown. Opportunity existed, but it came with risks capable of destroying entire generations. Ambition within these families threaded through the court with a force that reshaped alliances and determined outcomes long before decisions became public. Influence gathered and dissolved around them as queens rose and fell, leaving behind traces of success and collapse in equal measure. Quiet shifts in these networks suggested that deeper struggles for power were beginning to tighten around the throne once more. Influence within Henry VIII's marriages rarely originated from the royal couple alone. Advisors and informants positioned themselves around the throne with calculated precision, shaping decisions before they reached the public eye. Their involvement formed an invisible network that stretched across political factions, religious interests, and international courts. Cromwell, Wolsey, Chapuis, and numerous unnamed figures contributed to a system where every alliance, drama, and betrayal carried weight far beyond the intentions of any single queen. Thomas Wolsey, the earliest of Henry's great advisors, established the foundation for this environment. His authority extended through diplomacy, church administration, and court management. Wolsey understood the importance of controlling information, ensuring that correspondence passed through channels he monitored closely. During Catherine of Aragon's period as queen, he influenced negotiations with Rome and Spain, shaping outcomes that aligned with his strategic vision. His failure to secure Henry's annulment, however, weakened his standing and revealed the delicate nature of an advisor's position. Once he lost the king's confidence, his influence evaporated swiftly. Thomas Cromwell operated with a different type of precision. He favoured detailed reports to intelligence gathering and swift execution of plans. Cromwell maintained networks that reached into noble households, foreign embassies, and religious communities. His ability to collect information allowed him to anticipate shifts within the court, especially during Anne Boleyn's rise and fall. He monitored the movements of ambassadors, studied the loyalties of courtiers, and cultivated informants who provided insights into private behaviours. His influence shaped the legal framework used to dismantle Anne's power, demonstrating how espionage and administration could merge into a single force. Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador, served as a chronicler of court tension. His reports to the Holy Roman Emperor detailed rivalries among the queens, grievances within the council, and rumours circulating among the populace. Chapuis aligned himself with Catherine of Aragon and later with Princess Mary, shaping his perspective but also amplifying the factional nature of the court. His letters often reflected a mixture of observation and strategic framing, designed to influence imperial policy. Through him, foreign powers remained deeply connected to England's domestic affairs. Espionage became a structural component of Tudor politics. Households associated with the queens employed informants to track rivals, ensuring that every movement within the palace carried the risk of exposure. Servants, attendants, and clerks reported conversations, gestures, and private conflicts to their patrons. These reports shaped arguments presented before the king, affecting decisions on marriage, succession, and policy. Even seemingly insignificant observations could be leveraged to undermine a queen's reputation or elevate the standing of her opponents. Rumours circulated through the court with remarkable speed. They travelled through corridors, kitchens, churches, and gatherings, gaining strength as they passed from person to person. Advisors recognized the potential of these whispers and used them strategically. A suggestion of impropriety, once released, became difficult to counter. Queens faced the constant threat of reputational damage, especially when factions sought to push them aside. Rumours served as early markers of political shifts, signalling when a queen's influence began to weaken. False letters and forced confessions became tools for reshaping narratives. Cromwell used such methods during Anne Boleyn's downfall, constructing a case that relied on manufactured interpretations rather than concrete evidence. The pressure placed upon accused individuals produced statements that reinforced the desired outcome, creating an appearance of legitimacy. These documents travelled through legal channels, transforming suspicion into an official record. Once written, they entered history with an authority that belied the circumstances under which they were created. Ambassadors participated in similar tactics, forwarding selective information to their home countries. Their correspondence shaped foreign policy and communicated the instability within Henry's court. Nations observing from afar adjusted their alliances accordingly, recognizing that each marriage influenced England's position within Europe. Espionage extended beyond internal factions, forming a web of competing interests that transcended national borders. As queens rotated through the court, advisors adjusted their strategies. A queen's religious stance, family alliances, and personal demeanor determined how advisors interacted with her. Some queens embraced these connections, using advisors to strengthen their positions. Others attempted to distance themselves, hoping to avoid entanglement in factional politics. Regardless of their intentions, they remained deeply affected by the advisors surrounding them. Those who misjudged the loyalties of these figures often found themselves isolated, unable to counter accusations or influence decisions in their favor. The pressure on queens increased as advisors intensified their surveillance. Every letter received or sent, every visitor admitted, and every private conversation risked exposure. Queens lived under constant scrutiny, aware that missteps could be documented and used against them. This environment fostered anxiety, creating conditions where trust became scarce. Even queens with strong alliances struggled to navigate the shifting networks of influence. The careers of advisors reflected similar instability. Many rose quickly, shaped policy, and wielded immense authority, only to fall when the king's favour turned. Wolsey died in disgrace. Cromwell faced execution, and Chapuis returned to the continent after years of tension. Their trajectories revealed the volatility of serving a monarch whose decisions pivoted rapidly in response to personal and political pressures. Espionage and counsel shaped not only the marriages, but also the broader direction of the English Reformation. The succession crisis, and the distribution of noble power. The advisors who operated within these networks influenced events far beyond the court's immediate conflicts. Their actions determined the pace of religious reform, the structure of legal authority, and the alliances that defined England's place in Europe. Queens caught within this system rarely escaped unscathed. Their reputations, safety, and authority depended on advisors whose motives did not always align with their well-being. Espionage magnified every error, while counsel shifted loyalties according to political advantage. The combination created an environment where survival depended on caution, awareness, and an acute understanding of the forces operating behind the throne. Layers of influence shaped each royal marriage, tightening around queens who seldom understood how deeply they were watched. Networks of advisors and informants adjusted their tactics as power shifted from one woman to another. Hints of emerging fractures suggested that darker struggles for control were beginning to press more heavily upon the court. Power inside Henry VIII's court depended not only on political factions and religious shifts, but also on the king's persistent fear of losing control over the women closest to him. Each queen entered the marriage with expectations that stretched far beyond companionship. She was expected to obey, reassure, and reflect the image of stability Henry wanted to project. Yet beneath that expectation sat an uneasy truth. Henry admired intelligent women, but he also feared them. This contradiction shaped the lives and fates of every queen who stood beside him. Queens who demonstrated sharp insight, strong will, or independent judgment often drew both admiration and suspicion. Catherine of Aragon possessed impressive education, political experience, and diplomatic awareness. Initially, these traits strengthened her partnership with Henry, especially during his early campaigns and negotiations. Over time, however, her confidence began to unsettle the king. Her ability to maintain foreign alliances and defend her own rights created tension when Henry sought freedom from their marriage. Her intelligence became a barrier rather than an asset, challenging the image of complete obedience he expected. Anne Boleyn faced similar consequences. Her wit, ambition, and keen understanding of court dynamics captivated Henry, pushing him toward decisions that reshaped England. Yet those same qualities soon contributed to her downfall. As Anne asserted her influence, she became entangled in political struggles that demanded complete loyalty from those around her. Her refusal to yield easily irritated Henry, who had grown accustomed to compliance. When factions exploited her perceived assertiveness, the king's fear of losing control intensified, creating conditions that made accusations against her believable in his eyes. The expectation of obedience extended to daily routines, religious practices, and social interactions. Queens were watched closely for signs of defiance, subtle disagreements, or private influence over the king. Even small gestures could be interpreted as attempts to manipulate policy. The pressure to remain agreeable produced an environment where silence often became a survival strategy. Some queens learned to temper their opinions, offering support without displaying too much independence. This approach provided temporary stability, but never true security. Jane Seymour's short reign illustrated the value Henry placed on quiet compliance. Her calm presence and measured behavior contrasted sharply with Anne's assertiveness. For a time, this pleased the king. He valued Jane's willingness to defer to him and her avoidance of political confrontation. However, the reward she received for this compliance was limited. Her early death prevented any long-term influence, and her brief period of favour revealed how quickly circumstances could shift. Compliance pleased Henry, but it did not protect a queen from danger or unexpected tragedy. Catherine Howard's youth and naivety placed her in another vulnerable position. Her apparent innocence initially soothed parts of the court weary from conflict, and Henry perceived her as someone easily guided. Yet her lack of experience also became a liability. When rumours and investigations swirled around her, the king's fear of betrayal overshadowed any affection. Her downfall reflected not only the consequences of political manipulation, but also the fragility of a queen who failed to maintain the controlled image expected of her. Catherine Parr demonstrated a different form of navigation, educated and articulate. She possessed the capacity to challenge Henry intellectually, yet she recognized the danger of appearing too assertive. Her ability to balance intelligence with restraint allowed her to survive in an environment where many before her had not. She moderated her religious interests, chose her words carefully, and maintained a demeanor that avoided triggering Henry's suspicion. Her survival highlighted the delicate line queens walked between influence and perceived threat. Fear shaped more than marital expectations. It influenced how the court reacted to each queen's presence. Advisors assessed a queen's intelligence not only to predict her influence, but also to gauge whether she might disrupt existing power structures. Those who felt threatened by stronger queens used subtle strategies to undermine them, reinforcing the idea that controlled women were safer for the kingdom. Rumors, letters, and quiet conversations contributed to a narrative that framed assertive queens as dangerous, while compliant ones were portrayed as ideal. The king's shifting emotions intensified this dynamic. His inconsistent affections produced uncertainty that extended across the court. A queen admired one year might be condemned the next if she failed to meet expectations or if political tensions demanded a change. Henry used marriage as both a personal bond and a political tool, and queens bore the weight of both purposes. Their actions were measured not only for personal loyalty, but also for political reliability. A misinterpreted decision could be viewed as disobedience, fueling the king's anxieties. This environment created a cycle in which queens adjusted themselves to maintain safety. They learned to avoid overt displays of autonomy, to speak cautiously, and to manage relationships carefully. Any sign of independent thinking could draw suspicion, making survival dependent on presenting an image that blended grace with restraint. Even queens who sought only stability found themselves navigating a court where expectations shifted without warning. Fear and control defined the core of Henry's marriages. The king wanted devotion, admiration, and obedience. Yet he was drawn to women whose intelligence made them compelling figures. This contradiction ensured that no queen could fully satisfy the expectations placed upon her. Those who displayed strength risked appearing threatening. Those who remained quiet risked invisibility. In both cases, danger lingered. The steady pressure around each queen revealed how quickly affection could turn into restraint once power entered the room. Changes within the court deepened that tension, drawing sharper lines around those who dared to think or speak too freely. Hints of harsher consequences lingered in the air, pointing toward dangers waiting just beyond the fragile balance they tried to maintain. It settled into the court like a rule no one needed to speak aloud. The position of queen carried a glow in daylight and a shadow that lengthened with every passing hour. One morning, a woman could present as the center of a royal ceremony, surrounded by bowing courtiers and polished floors that reflected her status. By evening, those same corridors could turn cold, and the hands that once lifted her skirt hem might slip away as though they had never touched her at all. The transition from honor to accusation was quiet, and the court learned to watch without interfering. The crown on a queen's head did not steady her place. It only marked how far she might fall. Those who observed Henry's reign understood how quickly affection could shift into scrutiny. A gesture misunderstood, a rumor carried too far, or an enemy whispering into the right ear could shift the air around her. The ease with which praise turned into suspicion formed a constant tension that everyone felt, though none dared acknowledge it openly. The walls of the palace held the memory of women who had walked confidently through its halls one week and awaited judgment the next. Unequal judgment wrapped itself around each queen before she ever realized it. Accusations rarely came in clear form. They arrived as questions, then doubts, then warnings dressed as concern. The machinery of the court tightened slowly, and once it began, it did not reverse. Proof was never a requirement. The appearance of impropriety was enough to start a descent. Those who were the most visible were the most vulnerable, and no one occupying that role could escape the scrutiny that came with being tied to a king who valued certainty above fairness. Moral charges carried special weight. They were simple, flexible, and impossible to defend against once planted. A queen accused of improper conduct found herself facing expectations that no evidence could satisfy. Her silence could be used against her, and her words could be twisted to confirm the very thing she denied. These charges did not rely on facts, they relied on perception. Those bringing the accusations understood this, and they shaped their timing carefully, releasing them when the king's mood leaned toward frustration or disappointment. Inside the palace, servants continued their routines without interruption. Floors were polished, candles trimmed, and meals carried through narrow passages. The daily rhythm did not shift outwardly, but small details betrayed the tension beneath the surface. Conversations shortened, courtiers adjusted where they stood, subtly distancing themselves from the queen under scrutiny. The quiet was more revealing than any public announcement. People who once clustered around her kept their hands clasped, their gazes lowered, and their loyalty unspoken. For the queen herself, the transformation was disorienting. One day, she received nods of respect, and the next, she sensed absence more than presence. Doors opened with less warmth. Eyes followed her with calculation rather than admiration. Her attendants moved more stiffly, careful not to be linked too closely to her fate. She might continue her tasks, reading letters, offering guidance, appearing at the king's side. But the edges of her routine frayed with uncertainty. She felt the separation forming before she could name it. The court's reaction was always the same, a careful withdrawal that protected those who stepped back and isolated the woman at the center of the storm. Those who had smiled in her direction now stood closer to other factions. Those who once sought her favor shifted their allegiance with practiced ease. The queen's isolation became self-evident long before any official announcement. No crown could shield her from this slow abandonment. And once it began, The echo travelled through every chamber of the palace. By the time formal accusations reached her, the decision had already been made somewhere beyond her reach. She could listen to the charges, but she could not alter the outcome. Her position, once decorated and admired, now served as the very reason her downfall carried meaning for others. The court fed on movement, new alliances, new opportunities, new vacancies carved out of ruined lives. A queen's collapse created space for another rise, and many watched for these shifts with quiet anticipation rather than dread. The king's role in this process was more complex. His decisions were final, but they were shaped by moods, frustrations, ambition, and whispers that seemed harmless until they gathered into necessity. He did not need to raise his voice or show anger. His silence, or a single request to review a matter, was enough to push events forward. Those around him interpreted every gesture. They understood when to strike, when to accuse, and when to withdraw. The Queen's safety depended less on her actions and more on how others decided to interpret them. In the end, the transition from Queen to accused happened with a speed that startled even those who expected it. One day, she stood at the king's side. The next, she was led through quieter halls, her steps echoing in the absence of company. She was no longer a symbol of stability, but an object of examination. The crown that had once carried her upward now felt like a reminder of how the court valued its own survival over truth. Position meant nothing without favour, and favour was more fragile than anyone wished to admit. Her gilded role revealed its cost, pressing her into a space where admiration and danger existed within the same breath. Movements within the court deepened that shift, tracing how quickly honour could turn into isolation. Whispers drifting through those halls hinted at consequences, waiting for those whose missteps aligned too neatly with the ambitions of others. Tension settled into the royal household long before Mary and Elizabeth were old enough to recognise its shape. Their lives began at opposite ends of a conflict that neither child created. Yet both were forced to inherit. Each carried the weight of a mother whose fate had drawn a line through the court, one marked by humiliation and loss, the other by execution and lasting suspicion. The divide between them did not grow from personal animosity, but from the unresolved grievances left behind by Catherine and Anne. And the court knew how to keep those wounds open. Mary grew up remembering shadows that stretched across her early years. She understood the silence that followed her mother's removal and sensed the shifts in treatment, even before she reached maturity. Her place at court reflected the king's frustration rather than his affection, and the distance between them shaped her inner world. She watched the throne from a position that once felt secure, but now demanded caution. Every nod, every gesture, every instruction she received carried an undertone of conditional acceptance. Elizabeth's experience unfolded differently, yet the weight on her shoulders pressed just as hard. Her mother's fall had left marks that time could not erase, and the court observed her with a careful blend of curiosity and restraint. She grew accustomed to reading the room before stepping into it. Her movements were quiet and deliberate, shaped by the understanding that any misstep would confirm fears rooted in the past. Though she carried the king's name, she also carried the memory of Anne's execution, and that memory followed her wherever she went. The divide between them deepened as both girls became symbols rather than individuals. Mary represented the old order tied to Catherine, marked by duty, endurance, and the shadow of displacement. Elizabeth stood as the reminder of a transformation that had altered the kingdom's religious and political direction. Their identities became extensions of conflicts far greater than themselves, and courtiers aligned their loyalties accordingly. Neither girl had the freedom to define her own role. The expectations built around them did that work. Court factions fostered the distance, encouraging an atmosphere where comparison overshadowed understanding. Mary endured whispers about her legitimacy, while Elizabeth navigated suspicions tied to her lineage. Each girl observed the court's reactions, noticing when their presence stirred discomfort or when a small gesture carried implications neither had intended. Their shared blood mattered less than the unresolved tension inherited from their mothers. The quiet competition between them rarely surfaced directly. Instead, it lived in rearranged seating at ceremonies, altered schedules, and unexpected absences from gatherings where both might have appeared together. Their education, movements, and interactions were shaped by advisors who understood the political value of each young woman. Those who aligned with Mary emphasized tradition, while those who supported Elizabeth looked toward a future shaped by new ideas. Between these positions lay a gulf that neither child had chosen. Mary's memories of Catherine reinforced her sense of responsibility. She carried her mother's resilience as part of her identity, holding tightly to beliefs that had once supported the Queen during her descent from favour. Elizabeth, in contrast, internalized caution. She built her understanding of the world around silence and observation, watching how decisions formed and how alliances shifted. Their approaches differed, yet both were shaped by loss. Loss of security, loss of certainty, and loss of the mothers whose conflicts had defined the court. As they matured, the tension between them gained political meaning. Advisors interpreted their actions through biased lenses, creating narratives that served their ambitions. Small gestures became evidence of rivalry, a choice of reading material, an expression during the ceremony, or a moment of hesitation could be used to support claims about their suitability for influence. Their individual intentions mattered less than the political interpretations assigned to them. Despite this, moments existed in which their shared circumstances created echoes of connection. Both understood how the court could twist a woman's life into something unrecognizable. Both knew how easily a mother could be replaced or condemned. They carried these understandings quietly, and while it did not erase the distance between them, it added a layer of recognition that could not be entirely suppressed. They were shaped by parallel experiences, even if positioned at opposite ends of the same history. The deeper impact of their inherited rivalry lay in how it influenced the kingdom's outlook. Courtiers projected the divide outward, reinforcing political and religious tensions already present in the country. The court mirrored the fractures of the realm, and Mary and Elizabeth became focal points for struggles that extended beyond palace walls. The separation carved between them became symbolic, a reflection of the unresolved conflicts that marked Henry's reign. By the time they reached adulthood, the weight of their mothers' histories had molded them into figures whose identities were tied not only to personal experiences, but to national expectations. Observers noted how each carried the legacy of a queen who had fallen, and how that legacy continued to cast long shadows across the realm. It was not simply the divide between two daughters. It was the continuation of a wound left open by choices made long before. Their lives revealed how inherited conflict could settle into daily routines, shaping decisions in ways neither woman had chosen. Movements within the court reinforced that divide, deepening the gulf tied to the fates of the mothers they barely remembered. A quiet question lingered in those halls, hinting at shifts, waiting for the moment when both daughters would face the weight of a kingdom, prepared to exalt one and challenge the other. Tension over faith settled quietly into the court long before anyone admitted how deeply it shaped the lives of those who moved through its halls. Catherine's unwavering loyalty to Catholic tradition remained visible in the routines she maintained and the advisors she trusted. Her presence reminded the kingdom of ties that reached across Europe, linking England to a network of beliefs and expectations that had defined royal authority for generations. Those who supported her found comfort in familiar rituals that offered structure in a period filled with uncertainty. Her influence rested on a sense of continuity, and many believed it would hold indefinitely. Anne's entry into the court disrupted that balance with a force that few anticipated. Her connections to reformist ideas, though not always spoken openly, carried an energy that unsettled those committed to the old order. She represented a possibility that the court might shift its spiritual foundations. Her supporters saw in her an opportunity to break from traditions that felt rigid and outdated, while those who opposed her viewed each change as a threat to stability. The tension between these two outlooks did not burst suddenly. It built gradually. As advisors adjusted their alliances and courtiers learned to navigate a landscape divided by faith as much as by loyalty, the court became a mirror of the kingdom's growing fracture. In one chamber, symbols of Catholic devotion remained carefully arranged, their placement unchanged for years. In another, new texts circulated quietly, handled with caution, yet carrying ideas that moved with surprising speed. Servants tasked with maintaining these spaces learned to step carefully, their work observed by those who sought evidence of change. Each small alteration, an object replaced, a book removed, a ceremony shortened, acquired meaning in the eyes of watchers who feared, or hoped, for transformation. Catherine's supporters relied on memory to sustain their confidence. They recalled her restraint, her consistent practice of faith, and the alliances that had once protected England from instability. Their commitment was less about her personal influence and more about what she represented, a steady link to traditions that seemed inseparable from national identity. To them, abandoning Catholicism felt like unraveling a thread that held the monarchy together. The court's older members shared this concern most strongly, sensing that any shift would replace familiar certainties with unfamiliar pressures. Anne's influence, however, spread through a different mechanism. It appealed to those who viewed reform as a step toward independence. Politically, spiritually, and personally, her rise encouraged courtiers who believed change could grant England greater control over its direction. These individuals interpreted the king's interest in her not only as an emotional shift, but as a sign that new ideas might gain legitimacy. Their confidence rested not on tradition, but on the possibility of reshaping the court into something more flexible, less dependent on old alliances, and capable of defining its own foundations. The conflict between these factions did not erupt into open confrontation. Instead, it moved quietly through letters, recommendations, and whispered warnings. Advisors chose their words carefully, knowing that a misplaced phrase could align them with the wrong side. The king's reactions carried heightened significance. As courtiers watched for indications of which religious influence he might favour, his decisions on matters unrelated to faith were nonetheless interpreted through a lens shaped by this underlying tension. Within this environment, the role of each queen expanded beyond personal identity. Catherine became the embodiment of steadfast Catholic devotion, while Anne's presence signalled the advance of emerging reformist thought. Their personal beliefs mattered, but the court magnified those beliefs into symbols, drawing lines between groups that viewed the future of England through incompatible visions. Their influence extended not only through their actions but through the interpretations of those around them. Even a gesture, a favoured advisor, or a quiet conversation could alter perceptions of where the kingdom might turn. Servants, scribes, and attendants witnessed these shifts with a mixture of caution and resignation. Their tasks remained unchanged, yet they sensed how the atmosphere grew heavier as religious identity became a measure of loyalty. The smallest details, how a prayer was spoken, which text was consulted, which chapel was visited, acquired new significance. Those working in the palace learned to manage their expressions, understanding that any indication of preference could place them in a precarious position. As tensions spread, the kingdom outside the palace felt the ripple. Local leaders, clergy, and merchants listened closely for any signs of which direction the crown might choose. The court's silence on certain matters, or its emphasis on others, shaped how communities understood their own spiritual landscape. Religious uncertainty filtered into everyday life, influencing everything from trade agreements to cultural practices. The personal conflict between the two queens became a national question that touched every household in one form or another. Over time, the weight of these competing influences carved a distinct line through the royal identity. The court no longer reflected a unified vision of faith, but a contested terrain where each decision carried consequences that reached far beyond ceremonial boundaries. Catherine's adherence to tradition and Anne's embrace of reform framed a struggle that extended into every part of the kingdom, shaping expectations for future queens and determining how authority itself would be understood. Their opposing beliefs settled into the heart of the court, revealing how spiritual identity could divide even the most guarded spaces. Movements between factions deepened that divide, signaling how faith had become a measure of loyalty rather than conviction. Whispers drifting through the palace hinted at coming shifts, carried by those who sensed that religious allegiance would soon determine more than personal standing. The influence of Henry VIII's queens did not dissolve when their lives or marriages ended. Instead, it settled into the court as a series of quiet legacies, each one shaping the kingdom in ways that outlived the women themselves. Catherine's presence remained tied to an enduring sense of morality that many continued to reference long after she had been set aside. Her insistence on maintaining dignity through hardship became a model of conduct, not only for those who admired her, but also for those who feared appearing weaker in comparison. Her legacy was not written through policy or proclamation. It lived in the expectations that continued to apply to every woman who stepped into the role she once held. Anne's legacy emerged differently, shaped not by endurance, but by the force of the transformation she had represented. Her fall echoed through the court with a weight that never disappeared. Yet her influence persisted through Elizabeth, whose childhood carried the imprint of a mother she never knew. The court remained conscious of this connection. Advisors watched Elizabeth grow, with a mixture of caution and anticipation, understanding that her lineage could either destabilize or redefine the kingdom. Even those who had opposed Anne could not ignore the possibility that her daughter might one day rise to a place of authority. The memory of Anne's ambition lingered, shaping how the court interpreted Elizabeth's actions, posture, and potential. Catherine Parr's legacy settled with a quieter steadiness. Her role did not provoke the same turbulence that Catherine and Anne had endured. Yet her influence reached deeper into the structure of the royal household. Her commitment to education shaped the environment in which Henry's children matured. Lessons arranged under her guidance introduced them to ideas that fostered reflection rather than obedience, creating a foundation for future governance that extended beyond ceremonial expectations. Her steadiness allowed her to endure where others had fallen, and this endurance allowed her contributions to take root without interruption. These legacies coexisted within the court, influencing decisions in ways that could not be easily separated. Catherine's adherence to principle served as a benchmark that advisors used to measure the character of later queens. Anne's dramatic rise and fall warned against underestimating the impact of ambition tied to shifting political currents. Catherine Parr's influence framed the intellectual development of the royal children, shaping how they perceived their roles within a kingdom undergoing constant transition. No queen existed in isolation. Each one's presence altered the atmosphere for those who followed. The courtiers who had served through multiple reigns observed these shifts with a kind of practiced awareness. They recognized how the memory of Catherine influenced judgments about perseverance. They noticed how the memory of Anne created caution whenever a queen displayed confidence beyond what the court considered acceptable. They acknowledged how Catherine Parr's influence softened rigid expectations of royal upbringing. Though these observations remained unspoken, they shaped behavior at every level. Servants adjusted their tone. Advisors refined their strategies. Every decision carried a trace of the legacies these queens had left behind. The kingdom outside the palace felt these impressions as well. Catherine was remembered as a figure of duty, a symbol of endurance that resonated across villages and cities. Her refusal to abandon her position shaped how people understood loyalty within the royal family, influencing opinions long after her death. Anne's memory travelled through stories that revealed the court's shifting moral boundaries. She was viewed as both a catalyst and a warning, marking a decisive turn in the kingdom's religious and political identity. Catherine Parr was recalled more quietly, her influence unfolding through the education and stability she helped provide for the children who would one day lead. As years passed, these legacies intertwined. Catherine's dignity became a reference point for understanding queenship itself. Anne's connection to Elizabeth grew more significant as Elizabeth's potential became clearer to those around her. Catherine Parr's educational influence prepared the foundation for a future in which the royal household would not rely solely on tradition. These women, each shaped by unique circumstances, contributed to a political landscape that outlived them. Their influence moved through policy, perception, and the personal development of those next in line for power. Even in moments of silence, the court felt the weight of their presence. A gesture from Elizabeth might remind older courtiers of Anne's determined posture. A calm decision from Mary reflected Catherine's unwavering composure. A thoughtful phrase from Edward echoed the lessons arranged by Catherine Parr. Though none of these connections were spoken openly, they formed pathways through which the past continued to guide the present. Each queen, whether through endurance, disruption, or instruction, we had left marks that shaped expectations about what the monarchy could become. Over time, the legacies of these women did not fade. They settled more deeply into the kingdom's identity. Catherine's model of duty influenced how future queens were compared and judged. Anne's dramatic arc shaped the kingdom's relationship with change, ambition, and reform. Catherine Parr's quiet contributions helped mould the intellectual environment that guided future rulers. Their influence extended beyond their lives, suggesting that queenship itself was defined not by survival alone, but by the lasting impressions left on the structures of the kingdom. Their influence lingered across the court, settling into decisions that continued to echo long after their reigns ended. Shifts within the palace revealed how these legacies intertwined, guiding choices in ways few dared to name directly. Hints of deeper consequences drifted through those chambers, pointing toward outcomes waiting to surface when the weight of these memories aligned. The role of queen carried a polish that caught the eye before revealing the dangers stitched beneath it. From a distance, the position appeared secure, framed by ceremony, attendance, and a place beside the king. Yet within the palace, those who watched closely understood how fragile that security truly was. Each woman who stepped into the role entered a space where admiration could not be separated from risk, and where visibility made her both central and vulnerable. The promise of influence often masked the reality that she stood in a place marked by hidden threats. Becoming queen did not guarantee protection. It only amplified the scrutiny placed upon her. Every action was observed, recorded, and interpreted according to shifting expectations that changed without warning. A smile held too long, or a hesitation at the wrong moment, could be transformed into suspicion. Advisors and courtiers tracked her movements, balancing their own alliances while assessing how her presence might alter their standing. Her safety depended not on rank, but on favour, something that could thin quickly and vanish entirely. Within the palace, the routines that defined daily life served as a constant reminder of these uncertainties. Attendants appeared promptly, carrying out their tasks with practiced precision. But beneath their steady movements lay a quiet calculation. They understood how the winds of power shifted and how easily a queen's fortunes could turn. Those who served her adjusted their tone subtly, measuring each interaction in case the court demanded a different allegiance tomorrow. Their outward composure concealed the reality that proximity to a queen could be as dangerous as it was prestigious. The dangers tied to queenship did not always appear in dramatic form. They crept forward through procedures that seemed ordinary until they sharpened. A request for clarification could become an inquiry. An inquiry could become an accusation. Accusations often reached the queen before she even sensed a threat forming. The transition between stability and danger was understated, marked not by declarations, but by the absence of support she once relied on. Loyalty receded quietly, leaving her to face the consequences with diminishing allies. Power for these women did not resemble power as others understood it. It brought influence, but also exposure. Their decisions shaped the king's behavior, the court's expectations, and the kingdom's perception of the monarchy. Yet this same influence invited resentment from factions eager to protect their own interests. A queen's visibility made her a convenient target, especially when political tensions ran high. She was held responsible not only for her actions, but for shifts that had little to do with her choices. Blood marked the stories of many who entered this role. The court remembered those who had walked to the scaffold, their names etched into the palace's sense of caution. Their downfall served as a warning to any queen who believed her position secured her place. Those who lived through such events carried those memories with them, altering how they moved through the palace and how they interpreted silence, glances, and changes in routine. The threat of losing everything, life, dignity, and legacy, remained with them from the moment they rose to prominence. Reputation, too, proved fragile. Once damaged, it rarely recovers. Rumors held more weight than truth, and accusations tied to moral expectations were especially destructive. Queens understood that the standards applied to them were harsher than those applied to the men around them. Their lives became performances shaped by rigid expectations they could never fully satisfy. A misinterpreted gesture or a single complaint whispered to the right advisor could threaten the structure they had worked to maintain. Even those who survived their time as queen felt the strain of existing within these constraints. They learned to quiet their reactions, to steady their expressions, to measure every step through the palace, as though each movement carried political implications. Their endurance became a skill, one developed not by desire but by necessity. Survival required constant attention to tensions beneath conversations, to the king's shifting moods, and to the ambitions of those who sought influence through their downfall. The palace itself reflected these tensions. Its polished surfaces, orderly chambers, and formal gatherings masked the presence of quiet strategies unfolding beneath. Servants, advisors, and courtiers contributed to this atmosphere, each navigating their own calculations. The queen stood at the center of this system, both powerful and exposed, carrying the weight of expectations that extended beyond her own identity. She was the figure through whom the court projected its fears, ambition, and grievances. Over time, these patterns repeated with enough consistency that the role of queen came to resemble a threshold rather than a destination. Women stepped into it knowing that the honor it offered came with uncertainties too large to ignore. Some hoped their conduct might shield them. Others believed their alliances could secure their position. Yet the stories of those who had come before showed the limits of caution. The court required queens, but it consumed them readily when circumstances shifted. Their presence revealed how power pressed against those who held it, leaving admiration intertwined with danger. Movements within the court exposed the thin barrier separating royal honor from sudden vulnerability. Quiet signals drifted through those chambers, pointing toward consequences, waiting when the crown demanded its next sacrifice. Years at court revealed a truth that grew heavier with each passing season. No participant in Henry VIII's marital conflicts ever emerged untouched or triumphant. What appeared at first to be a series of personal decisions gradually unfolded into a pattern that reshaped the kingdom and the king himself. Henry moved through his later years with an unspoken fatigue, as though each corridor he crossed carried reminders of the alliances he had formed and broken. Observers sensed this decline not in sudden gestures, but in the slow erosion of confidence that once defined his rule. His relationships, once rooted in affection, ambition, or political necessity, eventually collapsed into cycles of suspicion and disappointment. Each queen entered his life with the promise of stability or renewal. Yet each departure, whether through annulment, death, or execution, left fractures that spread through the palace. His attempts to secure loyalty only deepened the instability surrounding him, creating conditions that amplified fears rather than easing them. By the end of his reign, Isolation settled around him with a weight that no ritual or triumph could disperse. For the queens, the cost was far more devastating. Their positions placed them in proximity to power, but offered no real defense against the dangers tied to it. They were exposed to shifting loyalties, sudden changes in the king's temperament, and political factions that thrived on the opportunity created by their vulnerability. Catherine endured removal despite her unwavering devotion. Anne faced execution after becoming the symbol of a transformation she did not fully control. Jane experienced a brief moment of acceptance, only to die before she could influence her position. Anne of Cleves entered as a diplomatic necessity and left as a reminder of how swiftly a queen could be discarded. Catherine Howard's youth provided no protection, and Catherine Parr survived, only by navigating the court with caution, sharpened by experience. Their stories, though varied, shared a common thread. Each woman encountered a system that demanded compliance while offering little stability. Their influence could rise and fall in a single moment, determined not by their character, but by the shifting ambitions of those around them. Politics shaped their fates more than affection ever could. The palace consumed their presence, leaving behind traces of suffering, endurance, and unforeseen consequences that outlasted their reigns. Beyond the palace walls, the impact of these marriages rippled outward. Decisions rooted in personal conflict transformed the religious and political identity of England. Alliances formed and dissolved in response to the king's domestic turmoil. Communities felt the effects through changing doctrines, altered legal structures, and uncertainty surrounding the succession. Households across the kingdom recognized that the upheavals in the royal family extended into every level of national life, reshaping customs, worship, and expectations of governance. Courtiers carried their own burden within this environment. Each shift in the king's marital decisions forced them to reconsider alliances, adjust loyalties, and anticipate outcomes that evolved without warning. Survival at court became a matter of reading subtle changes rather than relying on established relationships. Those who adapted quickly maintained influence. Those who hesitated often faded from importance or found themselves aligned with a faction that no longer held the king's favour. The constant recalibration created fatigue that lingered beneath the elegance of ceremonies and formal gatherings. England, as a whole, absorbed these tensions into its identity. The emergence of new religious structures, the redefinition of royal authority, and the reshaping of diplomatic ties all carried marks of the king's marriages. Each union altered the trajectory of the realm, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically. The scars left behind revealed how struggles within the palace could transform the broader landscape. The kingdom became a mosaic of competing memories: Catherine's devotion, Anne's rise and fall, Jane's brief presence, Anne of Cleves's survival, Catherine Howard's collapse, and Catherine Parr's cautious endurance. Even in memory, these queens continued to influence the crown. Catherine became a symbol of loyalty and moral strength, her suffering remembered with quiet respect. Anne lived on through the legacy of Elizabeth, whose future reign would reshape England once again. Jane's legacy appeared through Edward, whose short rule marked another chapter of uncertainty. Anne of Cleves remained a reminder of diplomacy's fragility. Catherine Howard embodied the peril faced by young women placed at the centre of courtly designs. Catherine Parr's educational influence grew in significance as future monarchs adopted a more intellectual approach to governance. Henry's life reflected the cumulative weight of these legacies. His search for certainty fractured the structures he depended upon. His desire for authority isolated him. His pursuit of heirs altered the religious foundations of the realm. By the time he reached his final years, the image of a powerful monarch had shifted into one marked by regret, instability, and the lingering consequences of decisions that outlasted him. Those who had observed his reign understood that the cost of these marriages reached far beyond personal tragedy. Victory did not belong to any of them. Henry lost trust in those closest to him, and damaged the relationships that might have supported him. The queens, regardless of how they entered or left this position, were caught in mechanisms that used them as instruments rather than individuals. And the kingdom, absorbing the effects of their rise and fall, found itself permanently reshaped by the conflicts rooted in the king's search for certainty through marriage. Years of turbulence revealed how every decision carried consequences that none of them could foresee, leaving each life marked by the strain of the crown. Shifts in the palace deepened these marks, exposing how the pursuit of power created fractures that reached far beyond personal sorrow. Quiet movements across England suggested that the echoes of these marriages would continue to influence the realm long after Henry's reign faded into memory. Thank you for listening. May the night rest gently on your thoughts, and may sleep carry you into calm places, untouched by the weight of history. Good night.